Hey there, night wanderers. Tonight's story doesn't drift skyward, but downward, into the earth itself, a little darker than candlelight, a little heavier than silence, and just the tiniest bit terrifying. We're not following kings into battle or monks into prayer. Instead, we're stepping into the quietest, most unsettling corners of the medieval mind, the ways death could arrive and the ways people feared it most. Not just the plague that swept through villages, not just the crackle of flames at a stake or the chill of drowning waters, but deeper fears of waking up inside your coffin, of torture before execution, of slipping into the grave before your time. To live in the Middle Ages was to live side by side with death, and to know it might come in the most dreadful ways imaginable. You might smile now and think, surely they exaggerated. But for centuries these fears were very real, painted into church walls, whispered through graveyards, recorded by priests and physicians alike. Death wasn't only an ending, it was a spectacle, a lesson, and sometimes a nightmare that people prayed to avoid. Before we wander through those shadowed streets, those plague pits and parish yards, take a moment to tap like if you enjoy these softer walks into history's stranger corners. And if you're new here, welcome. This is our little firelit nook, where we trade the clash of swords for the quiet rustle of superstition, the small terrors, and the tender human details of the past. And if your eyelids are heavy, that's all right. This tale won't hurry. Death came slowly for many, after all. Now, before we begin, tell me in the comments, what's your cozy spot tonight? Are you curled under blankets, sipping tea, or just letting the dark settle around you? I'd love to know what your evening feels like. So, settle in. Pull the quilt higher, let your thoughts quiet, and take one long, steady breath. The grave is waiting, and with it, our quiet tale. In the Middle Ages, death was not an abstract concept, but a daily reality. Life expectancy at birth was shockingly low compared to modern standards, often averaging between 30 and 40 years. This figure can be misleading, however, because it was heavily skewed by high infant and child mortality rates. If someone survived the first precarious years of life, they had a decent chance of living into their 50s or 60s, and occasionally beyond. But the ever-present risk of death meant that every age group faced constant threats that could claim lives suddenly and without warning. One of the greatest factors pulling down average life expectancy was the vulnerability of infants. In some regions, as many as 1 in 3 children did not live past the age of 5. Causes range from complications during childbirth to malnutrition, infectious disease, and accidents. Medieval medical knowledge was limited, and midwives or family members who assisted at birth had few tools to intervene in difficult labours. Even if a child was delivered safely, the dangers of early life remained high. Diseases like measles, smallpox, and whooping cough circulated through communities, often striking the youngest first. Poor sanitation contributed to frequent outbreaks of diarrhea and dysentery, which were particularly deadly for infants and toddlers. Even something as simple as teething could become life-threatening if an infection developed. Breastfeeding offered some protection, but not all mothers were able to nurse, and alternatives like animal milk or gruel carried greater risks of contamination. Childhood was a fragile stage, and few families were untouched by the loss of a son or daughter. Surviving into adolescence did not guarantee safety. Young people faced new dangers, especially as they began to work and participate fully in household economies. Agricultural labour, apprenticeships in workshops, and service in wealthier households exposed them to physical accidents, malnutrition, and contagious illnesses. Adolescents in cities faced the additional risks of crowded living conditions, polluted water, and the spread of epidemics. For young men, military service or involvement in local feuds also carried high risks. Peasant uprisings, border conflicts, and recruitment into lords' armies placed many in situations where injury or death was likely. For young women, childbirth became a central danger. Maternal mortality rates were high, with some estimates suggesting that 1 in 10 women might die as a result of pregnancy or childbirth over the course of their lives. Infections, hemorrhage, and obstructed labour were common, and without surgical intervention or antibiotics, many women did not survive complications. Even in the prime of life, adults faced a precarious existence. Crop failures, famines, and seasonal shortages meant that malnutrition was a recurring problem. Malnourished bodies were more susceptible to disease, and during years of scarcity, mortality rates spiked dramatically. For example, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 claimed hundreds of thousands of lives across Europe due to starvation, weakened immune systems, and secondary diseases. Occupational hazards also contributed to mortality. Farmers risked injuries from heavy labour, animals, and tools. Artisans who worked with fire, chemicals, or metals often inhaled toxic fumes or suffered burns and accidents. In urban areas, poor sanitation created breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, and plague. Without clean water and sewage systems, people were constantly at risk of infection. War added another layer of uncertainty. Campaigns disrupted food supplies, exposed civilians to pillaging, and left soldiers vulnerable to both combat injuries and camp diseases. Siege warfare, in particular, could lead to high civilian casualties as hunger and disease ravaged besieged towns. Although less common, some individuals did live into their 60s or 70s, especially if they were wealthy, well-fed, and had access to better living conditions. Monks and nuns, for example, sometimes reached old age thanks to relatively stable diets and protection from warfare. But even for those who survived longer, frailty came earlier than in modern populations. Chronic illnesses such as arthritis, tooth loss, and vision problems reduced quality of life. Without modern medical support, even minor ailments could become fatal. The key feature of medieval mortality was unpredictability. A sudden fever, an infected wound, or contaminated food could kill within days. Communities lived with the knowledge that life could end swiftly, regardless of age. The Church reinforced this awareness through sermons and rituals that emphasized the memento mori, the reminder of death. People were encouraged to prepare for death spiritually, since it was never far away. In short, death hovered over medieval life, not only because of limited medical knowledge, but also because of the structural conditions of society: war, famine, disease, and lack of sanitation. From infants in cradles to elders in monasteries, no age group was free from the looming possibility of mortality. This constant presence of death shaped attitudes toward life, religion, and community, making fear and preparation for death a defining feature of the medieval experience. If high infant mortality and the uncertainty of adulthood kept medieval people constantly aware of death, there were three recurring forces that made life especially precarious: disease, famine, and violence. These weren't distant possibilities. They were regular visitors, arriving uninvited and leaving behind empty chairs at the table. The medieval world didn't need horror stories to frighten people. Real life provided enough. Disease was the most democratic killer. It did not much care whether someone was a peasant or a king. Epidemics swept through Europe repeatedly, carried by fleas, rats, or just the unfortunate habit of living in close quarters with poor sanitation. The Black Death of the 14th century was the most infamous example, killing perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population in just a few years. But plague was only one entry on the grim menu. Smallpox scarred faces, leprosy isolated the sick in special colonies, and dysentery punished anyone unlucky enough to drink contaminated water, which realistically meant almost everyone. Even monasteries, supposedly clean and orderly, were not immune. A monk could spend his days in prayer, only to end them doubled over from food poisoning at the evening meal. Everyday medical knowledge was limited, and treatments often ranged from useless to dangerous. Doctors prescribed bloodletting, herbal concoctions, or charms, while patients clung to saints' relics in hope of divine assistance. Sometimes the treatment was more lethal than the disease itself, but given the options, it is hard to blame anyone for trying. In towns and villages, outbreaks created widespread panic, and people sometimes fled their homes in hopes of finding safer ground. Of course, running away usually just helped spread the disease farther. In this sense, medieval epidemics were not unlike a very bad party guest. Once inside, they refused to leave quietly and made sure everyone suffered. If disease failed to claim you, famine was ready to step in. Medieval agriculture depended on weather, and bad weather could ruin harvests for an entire region. A wet summer might rot grain before it could be stored, while a harsh winter could wipe out livestock. Since transportation and trade networks were limited, Importing food in bulk was rarely possible. When local crops failed, people starved. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 demonstrated how devastating this could be. Continuous rain ruined crops, fields lay sodden, and entire communities went hungry. Chroniclers describe people eating bark, roots, or even resorting to cannibalism. It was not a time when anyone wasted food. Picky eaters had short lifespans. Hunger weakened the immune system, so famine rarely acted alone. Malnourished people were more likely to die of disease, creating a vicious cycle. Villagers sometimes tried to preserve food in inventive ways, but medieval preservation methods were limited. Salted meat, dried grain, or pickled vegetables only lasted so long, and in years of bad harvest, there simply wasn't enough to go around. The irony is that famine was both an immediate and a lingering danger. It could kill swiftly, as when villagers simply ran out of bread, or slowly, through years of stunted growth, weakened health and higher mortality during later disease outbreaks. And then there was violence, which made sure no one could ever feel too secure. The medieval world was rarely peaceful for long. Local feuds, banditry and wars between kingdoms constantly threatened ordinary people. Knights and soldiers might clash in grand battles, but civilians were often the ones who suffered most. A passing army could strip a village bare of food, burn houses and carry off livestock. Warfare didn't just kill directly, it also destroyed crops and disrupted trade, paving the way for, you guessed it, more famine and disease. Violence was not limited to organised war. The justice system itself could be brutal, with punishments that doubled as public spectacles. Thieves might be hanged, rebels drawn and quartered, and suspected heretics burned at the stake. Public execution was intended to deter crime, but it also reminded everyone that the line between life and death was thin, and authority could erase it quickly. On a smaller scale, disputes within villages could also turn violent. A quarrel over land or livestock might escalate into brawls, and without modern policing, settling scores often meant bloodshed. In short, medieval people lived with a constant background hum of risk. Disease struck without warning, famine stalked every harvest, and violence could erupt from strangers, neighbours or rulers. Each threat reinforced the others, creating a web of dangers that shaped daily life. To survive into old age was not only a matter of luck, but of navigating a world where the odds were consistently stacked against you. The surprising part is not that so many died young, but that anyone managed to live long enough to tell the tale at all. If disease, famine and violence weren't enough to remind medieval people that life was fragile, the church made sure no one ever forgot the larger implications of dying. In many ways, the religious framing of mortality was just as influential as the physical dangers. Death was not only an unavoidable end, but also a moral checkpoint, and the way you approached it mattered as much as the fact that it was coming. The Church's constant message was that everyone should be prepared, because eternity was a lot longer than 30 or 40 years on Earth. From an early age, people were taught to see death as both terrifying and necessary. Terrifying because it was followed by judgment, and God was not known for handing out participation trophies. Necessary because it marked the beginning of the eternal afterlife, which, if one played one's cards right, was far preferable to struggling through muddy fields and endless winters. The Church encouraged believers to live virtuously so they could avoid the ultimate punishment, hell, depicted in sermons and church art as a place full of fire, demons and endless torment. Medieval illustrations of hell left nothing to the imagination. If you thought dysentery was bad, wait until you saw a wall painting of devils roasting souls on spits. At the same time, the Church presented heaven as a comforting alternative. It was painted as a place of eternal light, peace and joy, a much-needed contrast to the harsh realities of medieval life. This carrot-and-stick approach was effective. Parishioners didn't just fear the plague or famine, they feared dying in sin and being condemned forever. A peasant might not know much about medicine or politics, but he definitely knew what happened to gluttons and usurers in the afterlife, because priests described it in lurid detail every Sunday. The idea of the good death was central to this worldview. A good death meant being spiritually prepared, having confessed sins, received last rites, and made peace with both God and neighbours. This was not always easy. Sudden deaths from accidents, war, or epidemic disease were especially feared because they left no time for spiritual preparation. Imagine the panic of realizing you were dying without a priest nearby, no confession, no absolution, and no guarantee that heaven's gates would open. For that reason, families often rushed to call a priest at the first sign of illness, sometimes competing with the reality that the disease would kill faster than the holy man could arrive. The church also made sure death was ever present in the cultural landscape. Churchyards were filled with graves, and funerals were public affairs. Sermons often reminded listeners that memento mori, remember you must die, was not just a phrase but a daily duty. To reinforce the message, the late medieval period gave rise to the danse macabre, or dance of death, a popular artistic motif showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life to the grave. Kings, priests, peasants and children were all shown in a grim parade, underscoring the point that no one escaped mortality. It was sobering, if also a little theatrical. Of course, not all of this was purely solemn. Medieval preachers had a flair for the dramatic, and some leaned into almost comic exaggeration to hammer home their lessons. Tales of sinners dragged off by demons during dinner, or of greedy merchants forced to vomit gold coins in hell, circulated widely. These colourful stories were entertaining enough to keep parishioners awake through sermons, while also reminding them to behave. In that sense, the church was something like the medieval version of public service announcements, equal parts warning and performance. Still, the underlying message was serious. Life was short, unpredictable, and eternally significant. Every cough, every poor harvest, every feud was not just a material threat, but a spiritual one. Death loomed at the door, and what came after depended on how well you had listened to the church's instructions. It was an effective system of social control. People might not obey their Lord, but most were reluctant to risk eternal damnation. In the end, the religious shadow of mortality was as constant as the physical dangers of medieval life. If plague or famine did not kill you, priests and preachers would ensure you were still haunted by the thought of what came next. Death was both a terror and a transition, and medieval Christianity managed to make it feel like both at once. Whether one found comfort in the promise of heaven or dread in the threat of hell, the conclusion was the same. Death was always close, and you had better be ready. If the medieval church made death feel like a moral cliffhanger, medicine added another layer of unease. What if you weren't really dead when they buried you? For people already surrounded by unpredictable disease and sudden loss, the possibility of premature burial became one of the most disturbing fears. Unlike famine or plague, this wasn't a problem of numbers but of certainty. How could anyone be sure when life had truly ended, especially in a world without modern medical tools? The blunt truth is that medieval medicine was ill-equipped to make fine distinctions between life and death. Physicians and barber surgeons had some knowledge of the body, but their methods were limited. A faint pulse, shallow breathing, or coma-like state could easily be mistaken for death. Today, doctors can use stethoscopes, brain scans and monitors to confirm death, but in the Middle Ages, judgment was based mostly on appearance. If the skin looked pale, the body was cold, and there was no obvious movement, a person might be declared dead, sometimes incorrectly. Certain illnesses made these mistakes more likely. Epidemics like the plague often caused people to collapse suddenly, and victims could fall into deep unconsciousness before death. Epileptic fits, strokes or diabetic comas, though the condition itself was not well understood at the time, could all produce similar confusion. Without the ability to measure vital signs accurately, family members, priests and physicians sometimes had to make decisions based on guesswork. It's not hard to imagine the anxiety this created. Better to bury too soon than to risk contagion, but what if the person was only sleeping deeply? Cultural practices around burial added to the problem. In much of medieval Europe, quick burial was standard. Disease, heat, and the lack of preservation methods meant that corpses could not be kept for long. To delay was to invite both decay and potential spiritual unrest. Souls, it was believed, should be laid to rest swiftly. As a result, funerals often took place within 24 hours of death. That left very little time to be certain a person was truly gone. When death struck a household, neighbours and relatives might gather, prayers would be said, and the body would be carried to the churchyard almost immediately. Speed made sense in a practical way, but it heightened the risk of mistakes. Medieval literature and chronicles occasionally reflect this concern. Stories circulated about people who stirred during their funeral rites or woke in coffins. While some of these tales likely leaned on exaggeration, they reveal a real cultural anxiety. The idea of scratching noises from inside a coffin or a mourner suddenly hearing a muffled cry was not just the stuff of ghost stories, it was a plausible outcome in a world where medicine was fallible. Even medical training itself highlighted the uncertainty. Physicians often emphasized signs like lack of breath on a mirror, stiffness of limbs or changes in skin color, but these were imperfect indicators. Rigor mortis might not appear immediately, pallor could be mistaken in poor lighting, and mirrors weren't always sensitive enough to detect faint breath. The reliance on these crude tests meant that errors were almost inevitable. For ordinary villagers with no physician available, judgment rested on experience and instinct, which could be even less reliable. It's worth noting that medieval people were not foolish. They were aware of these uncertainties. This is why later centuries saw the development of so-called safety coffins, fitted with bells or pipes that allowed a supposedly dead person to signal if they revived underground. While these innovations became more common in the 17th and 18th centuries, they had roots in earlier fears that had been circulating for generations. The very fact that such devices existed suggests that people had reason to worry. In practice, the risk of being buried alive was probably lower than the imagination suggested, but it was not non-existent. Premature burial did occur, particularly in times of epidemic when the pressure to dispose of bodies quickly outweighed caution. For a society already conditioned to see death everywhere, the thought that one might wake in the dark, entombed before one's time, was especially horrifying. Unlike famine or plague, this was a fate that combined two terrors at once, the fear of dying and the fear of being utterly alone. This anxiety about the boundary between life and death shows how fragile medical certainty was in the Middle Ages. People knew they could not rely on physicians to have all the answers. Death could not always be neatly diagnosed, and the haste of burial practices left little margin for error. In a time when the body and soul were believed to be closely intertwined, the idea of being misjudged by the living and abandoned underground was a nightmare scenario. The grave was supposed to be a final resting place, not an accidental prison, and yet the line between the two was thin enough to unsettle even the most devout. The fear of premature burial did not remain just a passing worry. It inspired practical, if sometimes odd, solutions. If medicine could not always tell life from death with certainty, then people sought mechanical or ritual ways to guard against mistakes. Out of this climate came the development of safety measures, later nicknamed safety coffins, as well as churchyard practices involving bells and ropes. These were, in effect, the medieval and early modern world's version of insurance policies against being buried alive. Ingenious in their intention, they also carried a certain eeriness that made funerals even more unsettling. The idea of attaching bells to the recently buried can be traced to the belief that the boundary between life and death was not always final. In some cases, a string was tied around the finger of the deceased and connected to a small bell above ground. The thinking was straightforward. If the person stirred after burial, they could tug the string, ringing the bell to summon help. The term "saved by the bell" is sometimes linked to this practice, though the phrase itself more likely came later. Still, the contraption reflected a genuine cultural unease. It was a simple system, but one that suggested everyone was at least a little suspicious of the physician's diagnosis. More elaborate designs appeared in later centuries, especially during the height of premature burial panics in the 17th and 18th centuries, but medieval practices laid the groundwork. Coffins were occasionally outfitted with pipes or air holes, ensuring that if someone was mistakenly interred alive, they would at least not suffocate immediately. Some accounts mention tubes that allowed mourners to check on the body by lowering a candle flame or speaking into the pipe, just in case the deceased answered back. As practical as this might sound, one imagines that any reply from underground would have startled the living into fleeing the graveyard rather than organising a rescue. The use of bells was not confined to strings and coffins. In many churchyards, watchmen or caretakers were tasked with staying alert in the days following a burial. This was partly to guard against grave robbers, but it also fit into the broader atmosphere of uncertainty. If noises came from a grave, someone had to be there to hear it. Whether many such rescues were ever carried out is questionable, but the practice itself shows the psychological grip of the fear. Better to prepare for an unlikely event than risk the shame and horror of having buried a person alive. Religious rituals reinforced these anxieties. The church insisted on speedy burials to protect the community from disease and to guide the soul to its proper rest. Yet the very urgency of this practice created the conditions for mistakes. Safety mechanisms like bells or pipes represented an uneasy compromise between the need to bury quickly and the fear of burying prematurely. They symbolised the tension between faith in divine order and the practical knowledge that human judgment could be flawed. In a sense, they were admissions of doubt wrapped in the solemnity of funeral rites. There was also a social dimension. Families sometimes demanded extra precautions, especially for wealthier relatives. Nobles or prominent townspeople aware of the risks might commission more elaborate safeguards to ensure that their status did not end with a humiliating premature burial. For the poor, who lacked the resources for such contraptions, the fear had to be faced with resignation. Death, like life, was easier to manage if one had money. The psychological impact of these practices cannot be underestimated. The presence of a bell string running from a coffin to the surface or a tube sticking out of the earth would have been a constant reminder that the dead might not be entirely gone. Graveyards became places not just of mourning but of unease, with the possibility of sudden sounds interrupting the quiet. While modern people might think of cemeteries as peaceful, medieval and early modern villagers often saw them as spaces of uncertainty, where one might encounter something disturbingly alive beneath the soil. Looking back, it is easy to dismiss these safety devices as eccentric or superstitious, yet they represent a rational response to the limitations of the time. Without advanced medicine, communities improvised. The solutions were imperfect and eerie, but they acknowledged a real problem. After all, what was more horrifying than the thought of waking in darkness, trapped beneath the earth? For medieval people, the small expense of a bell or a watchful attendant was worth it if it spared even one person from that fate. In the end, safety coffins and death bells illustrate both the ingenuity and the anxiety of medieval society. They were not widespread enough to protect everyone, but their very existence reveals how deeply the fear of premature burial ran. The grave was supposed to mark the end of suffering, not the beginning of a new horror, and so people devised whatever safeguards they could. These contraptions may not have saved many lives, but they certainly spoke to the medieval mindset. When in doubt, tie on a bell. If bells and air tubes were one way to hedge against mistakes, folklore offered another approach. Explain the rare and unsettling cases of people stirring after burial as something uncanny. For a society already steeped in stories of saints rising from tombs or sinners punished beyond death, the line between medical error and supernatural intervention was easily blurred. Tales of the living dead became a natural outlet for collective anxiety about premature burial, and they travelled widely across medieval Europe. One recurring theme in these stories was the corpse that would not stay put. Chroniclers sometimes wrote of coffins found disturbed or graves where noises were heard long after burial. In some cases, these were likely exaggerations or outright inventions, but they reflected a shared fear that the grave was not as final as it should be. When villagers heard scratching sounds near a burial site, they might attribute it not to a bell string but to the restless spirit of someone buried before their time, or worse, to a revenant rising to torment the living. Revenants were a particularly vivid part of this folklore. Unlike the more refined image of a ghost, a revenant was imagined as a physical body, reanimated and wandering after burial. Accounts from England, France and Central Europe described corpses rising from graves to knock on doors, spread disease or attack family members. In some stories, the explanation was sin. Those who had lived wicked lives were said to be unable to rest, returning to punish neighbours or communities. In others, the implication was that the burial itself had been mishandled, leaving the dead unsatisfied. But beneath the moral lessons, these stories may have reflected real experiences of mistaken burial. People who managed, however briefly, to revive underground and stir panic before dying for good. The vampire legends of Eastern Europe also tie into this complex of fears. Though modern vampire myths are shaped by later literature, medieval communities already told stories of corpses that rose to drink blood or sap life from the living. Archaeological evidence supports this. Some graves from the period show skeletons buried with stones in their mouths, stakes driven through their chests, or bodies pinned down with heavy rocks. These measures suggest that villagers worried not only about spirits, but about corpses that could physically move. Such practices may have originated as attempts to prevent revenants, or more pragmatically, to make sure no one buried alive could claw their way out. Church authorities often dismissed or condemned these stories, warning people not to indulge in superstition. Yet the same church also promoted tales of miraculous resurrections, where holy men and women returned from the brink of death or even rose after burial. The cultural atmosphere, then, was ripe for confusion. When someone was seen moving in a coffin or heard groaning during burial rites, was it a saint's miracle, a sinner's punishment, or simply a mistaken diagnosis? Few people could say with certainty, which is precisely why such stories spread. Folklore also served a practical role. It provided explanations for otherwise unexplainable events. In an age without medical science to clarify conditions like catalepsy or coma, it was easier to imagine supernatural causes. Communities retold these stories around firesides, adding layers of detail each time until the line between rumour and reality vanished. The living dead became part of the cultural landscape, reinforcing the idea that the grave could not be trusted and that extra caution was always necessary. These tales also shaped burial practices in subtle ways. Villages that feared revenants sometimes watched over corpses for several nights before burial, ensuring no unnatural movements occurred. Others adopted preventative measures, such as driving nails through clothing or binding the limbs of the deceased. Whether these actions actually prevented premature burials or not, they helped reassure the living that they had done their part to keep the dead where they belonged. What stands out is not that people genuinely believed in vampires or revenants in the way modern horror films present them, but that they used such stories to express and contain a very real anxiety. Premature burial was a medical and social problem. Folklore turned it into a moral and supernatural narrative. A villager might not understand how illness could mimic death, but he could accept the explanation that sinful souls refused to rest. A mother might not grasp the medical cause of her child's stillness, but she could believe in the danger of spirits stirring in the night. By blending superstition with observation, these cultural tales kept the fear alive across generations. Safety coffins and bells were one attempt to deal with uncertainty through technology. Revenants, vampires and restless corpses were another attempt to deal with it through story. Both reveal the same underlying reality. Medieval people could not be sure where death ended and life began. And so, the possibility of the living dead haunted not just graveyards, but imaginations. Among the most terrifying punishments of the Middle Ages, execution by fire became closely associated with heresy and witchcraft. Unlike plague or famine, which struck unpredictably, this was a form of death deliberately arranged by human authority, framed as both justice and purification. Fire in the medieval imagination was not merely destructive, it was cleansing. That symbolism made it the preferred weapon against those the church believed had corrupted their faith or community. The use of fire as punishment rested on a religious logic. The church taught that heresy was more dangerous than theft or murder because it threatened not just the individual soul but the entire Christian community. A thief stole property, but a heretic stole salvation, luring others into error. To combat this, authorities argued that the punishment had to match the crime, something visible, severe, and symbolically fitting. Fire was the obvious choice. It destroyed the body completely, preventing any relics or remains from being venerated. At the same time, it was framed as a purifying force, burning away sin. Officials described it as a final opportunity for the condemned to repent, even as flames consumed them. Witchcraft, though often prosecuted under secular law, was folded into this same framework. Witches were believed to have allied with the devil, spreading corruption just as heretics spread false teachings. Here, too, fire symbolized purification. Burning a witch was thought to destroy the demonic influence bound up with her body, ensuring that no trace of her wickedness survived. The fact that witch trials peaked in the late medieval and early modern periods only reinforced the association of fire with cleansing communities of spiritual pollution. The spectacle of the stake was as important as the punishment itself. Executions were deliberately staged as public events. Crowds gathered, sometimes in thousands, to watch. Officials wanted the lesson to be burned, quite literally, into collective memory. Sermons or proclamations often accompanied the act, reminding onlookers that the condemned had strayed from the faith and that obedience to the church was the only safeguard against similar fate. In this way, burning at the stake became less about individual guilt and more about community discipline. The psychological terror was enormous. While hanging or beheading could be quick, fire was slow and agonizing. The condemned might die from smoke inhalation or burns, but not before enduring intense suffering. Some accounts describe mercy killings, executioners strangling or garroting victims before the flames reached them, but even this was inconsistent. The point was not simply to kill, but to demonstrate the consequences of rebellion against orthodoxy. Unlike a soldier's death on the battlefield, this was a calculated display meant to frighten witnesses into compliance. There was also a legal dimension to the symbolism. By burning heretics or witches, authorities signalled that these crimes were offences against both God and society. Ordinary criminals might be hanged, but spiritual crimes required a punishment that removed the offender entirely. Ashes could not be buried in consecrated ground, denying the condemned a proper Christian burial. This reinforced the idea that heresy and witchcraft excluded individuals from the community of the faithful, not only in life, but also in death. It is important to note, however, that not every heretic or accused witch ended up at the stake. Punishments varied, and recanting could sometimes spare the condemned. Yet the association of fire with ultimate punishment stuck in the popular imagination. The very possibility that someone could be burned alive for their beliefs or for accusations of sorcery cast a long shadow. Villagers whispered about the dangers of questioning doctrine or dabbling in forbidden practices, not because as abstract theology frightened them, but because they had seen or heard of people reduced to ashes in the marketplace. Looking back, burning at the stake illustrates the way medieval societies used symbolism to enforce control. Fire was not chosen simply for its efficiency, but for its meaning. It terrified the body, warned the mind, and claimed to cleanse the soul. For ordinary people watching, it reinforced the constant theme of medieval life. Death was always near, and sometimes it arrived not through accident or disease, but through the deliberate decision of church and crown. In that sense, the stake was as much about shaping the living as it was about punishing the dead. If burning at the stake was chosen for its symbolism, the way it was staged was chosen for its impact. Executions in the Middle Ages were not quiet affairs conducted behind prison walls. They were deliberately public, designed to terrify communities into obedience. The stake, the gallows, or the scaffold were not just tools of justice. They were platforms for theatre. Authorities knew that fear was most effective when shared, and nothing shared fear quite like watching a neighbour, a stranger, or even a prominent figure reduced to ash in front of thousands. The organisation of such spectacles was deliberate. Notices went out in advance, summoning villagers, townspeople, and anyone within walking distance. Markets often shut down, and travellers diverted their paths, not to avoid the event, but to attend it. Executions were staged in central spaces, market squares, crossroads, or fields just outside the city gates, where visibility was high and crowds could be contained. In some cases, wooden scaffolds were built so that every detail of the punishment could be seen from a distance. The condemned were paraded to the site, a ritual that reinforced their humiliation. They might be dressed in special garments, marked with symbols of their crime, or forced to carry items associated with their offence. Heretics sometimes wore painted tunics or paper hats inscribed with devils. Witches might be bound with ropes or chains, sometimes accompanied by effigies of their supposed familiars. This procession was not simply practical, it turned the journey into a moral lesson for spectators, reminding them that sin and disobedience led to shame. Once at the execution site, speeches and rituals prolonged the event. Officials read aloud the charges, priests exhorted the condemned to repent, and scribes recorded every detail for the annals. The goal was not efficiency but emphasis. A quick death taught little, a drawn-out ritual etched itself into memory. Fire, in particular, took time to prepare. Faggots had to be stacked, oil poured, and the pyre arranged for maximum effect. The delay itself increased the tension, allowing onlookers to reflect on what they were about to see, and on what might happen to them if they ever strayed. Crowd participation was another essential element. Spectators did not simply watch, they jeered, prayed, or gasped. For some, it was entertainment, a grim break from daily labour. For others, it was a moral drama that reinforced their faith. Children were often present, brought by parents to witness firsthand the dangers of disobedience. Chroniclers occasionally noted how the crowd responded with approval when the condemned repented, or with outrage when they defied the authorities to the end. Either way, the community was involved, ensuring that the lesson extended beyond the victim to the entire audience. Executioners, too, played a visible role in this theatre. Far from anonymous figures, they were recognised professionals whose skill or lack thereof could make the difference between a quick end and prolonged agony. A poorly tied rope, a slow-burning pyre, or a botched beheading could turn the spectacle into chaos. Yet even failure carried meaning. It reminded onlookers that death was messy and merciless. In the case of burning, executioners sometimes offered a mercy by strangling the condemned before the flames took hold. But whether this happened often depended on the mood of the authorities and the will of the crowd. Authorities were fully aware of the deterrent value of such spectacles. Executions were timed and staged to make the greatest impression, sometimes during religious festivals when crowds were already large, or following major political events when the need for control was strongest. Burning a heretic during Lent, for instance, reinforced sermons about sin and salvation. Hanging rebels after a failed uprising reminded subjects that resistance would be crushed. The public display was not only about the individual crime, but about reinforcing the hierarchy of power. Of course, not everyone responded with pious fear. Some complained that executions encouraged morbid fascination, turning serious punishment into grim entertainment. There are hints in records of vendors selling food and drink to the crowds, of people treating the event like a festival. Authorities might have wanted obedience, but human nature ensured that curiosity, gossip, and even profit flourished alongside fear. The result was a strange mixture of solemnity and spectacle, of morality and carnival, that defined medieval justice. In the end, the public execution was less about eliminating a criminal than about choreographing a lesson. Burning at the stake was chosen to purify the soul. The spectacle surrounding it was meant to purify the community, or at least to scare it into staying in line. Few left such events unchanged. Whether horrified, entertained, or morally reinforced, spectators carried the memory home, where it served as a living reminder that in the medieval world disobedience could end not only in death, but in flames before the eyes of all. Chroniclers, clerics, and eyewitnesses often recorded what the condemned did and said at the stake, sometimes in painstaking detail. These narratives were not neutral reporting. They were tools shaped to emphasise either the justice of the punishment or the moral drama of defiance. But together, they provide a glimpse into how communities process the horror of watching someone burn alive. One recurring theme is the insistence on repentance. Authorities hoped that the condemned would confess their errors and reaffirm their faith just before the flames rose. Chroniclers often highlighted such scenes, describing victims who fell to their knees, begged forgiveness, or made the sign of the cross. These moments reassured audiences that the punishment was working as intended. Sin was being burned away, the community was safe, and the sinner's soul might still be salvaged. For the church, a penitent heretic made the best example, proof that even in death, obedience was possible. Yet not every victim cooperated. Some went to the stake defiant, and their words or gestures became the stuff of legend. Counts of Jan Hus in 1415, for example, describe him singing hymns as the flames consumed him, a striking contrast to the image of broken repentance. Joan of Arc, executed in 1431, was said to have called repeatedly on Christ and the saints, her cries echoing above the crowd until smoke silenced her voice. For sympathisers, such last moments turned executions into martyrdoms, undermining the intended message of authority. A heretic who died bravely could become an inspiration rather than a warning. Chroniclers were not blind to this risk, which is why descriptions often tried to control the narrative. Some emphasised the grotesque, bodies twisting in agony, voices turning to screams, flesh blackening as onlookers recoiled. These grisly details reinforced the idea that execution was dreadful enough to deter imitation. Others, however, recorded the courage of the condemned, either out of sympathy or because the spectacle itself left too strong an impression to ignore. In either case, the focus remained on the drama of the final moments, where the condemned faced death with either submission or defiance. Eyewitnesses sometimes added their own colour, reporting how the crowd reacted. Gasps, tears, or even cheers punctuated these events, and the final words of victims often became talking points in taverns and marketplaces for weeks afterward. Ordinary people debated whether the condemned had truly been guilty, whether their cries for mercy were genuine, or whether the authorities had silenced a truth-teller. Executions did not always close a case. They could just as easily spark ongoing controversy. Practical details also appear in these records, and they add to the grim reality. Fires did not always burn evenly. If wood was damp or poorly arranged, flames might smoulder rather than blaze, prolonging the agony. Chroniclers sometimes noted when executioners intervened, tightening ropes, adjusting kindling, or strangling victims before the flames could finish their work. These mercy killings were inconsistent, depending on local practice, the will of the authorities, or the temperament of the executioner. For witnesses, such moments unpredictability. Would the condemned die quickly or slowly? The uncertainty deepened the fear. What strikes modern readers is how ordinary medieval people absorbed these stories. To them, the stake was not just an execution method. It was a stage where moral truths were acted out in real time. Chroniclers shaped the script, but the audience supplied the interpretation. Some saw the flames as a divine lesson, others as a cruel spectacle, and still others as the beginning of legend. For example, sympathetic observers of heretics sometimes preserved last words in hushed tones, passing them along as proof that the condemned had died with dignity or even with God's favour. In this way, the official attempt to stamp out dissent could inadvertently fuel underground admiration. Ultimately, the accounts of victims' last moments reinforced the central theme of execution as theatre. Fire symbolised purification. The spectacle ensured that everyone witnessed the lesson, and the final words of the condemned provided the emotional climax. Whether the victim repented, resisted, or screamed in agony, those moments lived on in memory and record. They made the stake not only a place of death, but also a crucible for stories. Stories that outlasted the ashes and continued to shape how communities thought about obedience, defiance, and the terrifying power of the flame. Nothing in the period terrified communities more than the Black Death, the pandemic that struck Europe in the mid-14th century. Unlike the spectacle of execution, which was confined to certain places and individuals, plague was indiscriminate. It did not require disobedience or guilt. It claimed peasants, nobles, priests, and even kings with equal speed. For a population already accustomed to death as a constant neighbour, the Black Death's sudden arrival and horrifying symptoms pushed fear to new extremes. The first sign of the disease was usually a swelling, large, painful lumps in the armpits, groin, or neck. These buboes, from which the plague takes its name, could grow to the size of an egg or an apple, darkening as they filled with pus and blood. Chroniclers did not soften their descriptions. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence, reported that the swellings were strange tumours that appeared suddenly and quickly spread across the body. Within a day or two, fever followed, accompanied by vomiting, delirium and weakness so profound that victims could not stand. The decline was swift. Many died within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms, leaving families little time to react or prepare. The speed of the disease was one of its most terrifying features. In some towns, entire households perished within a week. A city might lose half its population in a matter of months. People could wake up healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall, while fueling rumours that the illness was supernatural. To contemporaries, it seemed as though invisible forces stalked the streets. Even the church struggled to explain it, alternately blaming divine wrath, planetary alignments, or poisoned wells. None of these explanations lessened the fear, since none offered a reliable defence. The visible nature of the disease made it especially horrifying. Buboes were not subtle. They bulged, oozed, and stank. As victims weakened, gangrene often set in, blackening the skin on fingers, toes, and noses. This death's mask contributed to the popular label of the plague as the Black Death. For those caring for the sick, there was no way to hide from the gruesome reality. Unlike hunger or battlefield wounds, which might be endured in silence, plague marked the body in ways that made every case a public warning. People could literally see their neighbours wasting away, and they knew they might be next. Efforts to fight the disease were largely futile. Physicians wore long robes and sometimes carried posies of herbs or spices, hoping to ward off the miasma or bad air thought to spread sickness. Treatments included bleeding, lancing buboes, or applying poultices of herbs, vinegar, or even animal products. Few of these did more than provide momentary comfort. In many cases, interventions hastened death. Communities resorted to desperate measures. Processions of flagellants whipping themselves through town squares, prayers and fasts intended to earn God's mercy, and sometimes violent scapegoating of marginalised groups accused of spreading the disease. None of it slowed the devastation. The sheer scale of mortality set the Black Death apart. Estimates vary, but Europe may have lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population between 1347 and 1351. Entire villages were abandoned, fields went untilled, and livestock wandered unattended. Graves filled so quickly that mass burials became common, stripping the dead of the dignity of individual funerals. Chroniclers described priests blessing carts piled with bodies or trenches filled until there was no room left. The horror was not only in the suffering of individuals, but in the collapse of the social and religious rituals that normally made death comprehensible. For survivors, the experience was scarring. Families disintegrated under the pressure. Parents abandoned children and friends refused to visit one another. Fear of contagion broke down bonds of community, replacing solidarity with suspicion. If burning at the stake demonstrated the power of authorities to control life and death, plague demonstrated how fragile that control truly was. No ruler, no bishop, and no doctor could stop it. In the end, the Black Death's horror lay in its combination of speed, visibility, and scale. It killed too quickly for communities to adapt, disfigured its victims in unforgettable ways, and left behind a landscape of mass graves and shattered families. Where execution by fire terrified because of its deliberate cruelty, plague terrified because it seemed arbitrary and unstoppable. For medieval people, it was proof that death could come not only in a blaze of punishment, but also in a whisper of fever and the swell of a bubo. If the Black Death horrified people with its speed and symptoms, it was the social reaction that showed just how deeply fear could unravel communities. The disease did not just kill, it dismantled the bonds of trust that normally held medieval society together. Faced with an invisible and unstoppable enemy, people fell back on isolation, panic-driven behaviour, and all too often scapegoating those who were easiest to blame. One of the most common responses was withdrawal. Chroniclers note that families abandoned their sick relatives, neighbours shut doors against one another, and entire villages tried to seal themselves off. In Florence, Boccaccio observed that some households barricaded themselves indoors, avoiding any contact with outsiders. Others fled cities altogether, retreating to countryside estates in the hope of escaping infection. Of course, flight often carried the disease to new places, but the logic at the time was simple: survive by cutting ties. For a culture that normally prized kinship and communal solidarity, such withdrawal was shocking. Death did not just empty homes, it isolated those still alive. Panic showed itself in other ways too. Some turned to extreme piety, convinced that the plague was God's punishment. Flagellant groups appeared across Europe. Bands of penitents who marched through towns whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins. Crowds gathered to watch, hoping these spectacles would bring divine mercy. Authorities were uneasy about these movements, fearing they stirred unrest as much as devotion. But the very popularity of flagellants showed how desperate people were for an explanation and a cure. Others responded in the opposite way, embracing indulgence. If death was inevitable, some reasoned one might as well drink, feast, and seek pleasure while time remained. Medieval observers condemned this behaviour as reckless, but it reflected a raw recognition that tomorrow was uncertain. Blame was another recurring response, and it often turned violent. Lacking a clear medical explanation, people sought human culprits. In many regions, Jewish communities became the primary targets. Rumours spread that Jews had poisoned wells or spread powders to infect Christians. These accusations led to pogroms, particularly in German-speaking lands, where entire Jewish populations were massacred or expelled. Such violence did nothing to stop the plague, but it offered frightened communities a sense of control by identifying scapegoats. It also reinforced pre-existing prejudices, turning crisis into an excuse for persecution. Foreigners, beggars, and lepers were also vulnerable. Lepers, already marginalised and forced to live in separate colonies, were accused of spreading the disease intentionally. Beggars who moved between towns were suspected of carrying infection. Foreign travellers, unfamiliar and easily distrusted, could be treated as carriers of the plague simply by virtue of their difference. The logic was brutal. If the disease was spreading, someone must be responsible, finding that someone provided a grim kind of reassurance, even if it led only to more death. Panic also reshaped religious life. In some towns, priests refused to administer last rites out of fear of contagion, while in others, clergy died in such numbers that parishes were left without leadership. Pilgrimages and processions multiplied, even though large gatherings often worsened the spread. Some communities built new chapels or shrines, hoping to attract divine favour. Others, however, turned against the church, angry that prayers and rituals failed to protect them. This crisis of faith revealed the strain between spiritual authority and practical survival. When neither medicine nor religion could provide safety, fear filled the gap. Isolation and blame had long-term effects as well. Survivors remembered the breakdown of trust and carried those scars into later generations. Legal records after the plague show disputes over abandoned property, orphaned children, and broken contracts. Families that once might have cared for each other now had histories of desertion. Communities that had massacred their Jewish neighbours found themselves without important economic and cultural contributors. The plague, in other words, left social fractures as deep as the demographic losses. In the end, the reaction to the Black Death was as devastating as the disease itself. Isolation eroded kinship ties, panic drove people to extremes of piety or indulgence, and scapegoating fueled violence against the innocent. If the symptoms of plague horrified the body, the social response horrified the mind. For medieval people, the lesson was grim. Not only could death come swiftly and without warning, but it could also turn friends into strangers and communities into mobs. In that sense, the plague was more than an epidemic. It was a test of social fabric, and one that most places failed. Normally, burial in the Middle Ages was a careful communal affair. Families gathered, priests performed rites, and bodies were laid to rest in consecrated ground, with the expectation of resurrection on Judgment Day. The Black Death shattered these patterns. With bodies piling faster than they could be blessed, communities resorted to mass graves and hurried interments that stripped death of its usual dignity. Chroniclers describe the grim logistics with bluntness. In Florence, bodies were carted daily through the streets, stacked one atop another like merchandise. In London, pits were dug in churchyards and filled until the soil could hold no more. A chronicler in Siena wrote that so many died each day that they dug deep trenches and put them in by hundreds, stowing them tier upon tier like ship's cargo. Priests who normally recited prayers over each grave found themselves overwhelmed, sometimes blessing entire loads of corpses at once. The dignity of individualized ritual gave way to the urgency of disposal. The sheer scale of mortality forced communities to improvise. In cities, carts became a common sight, rattling through neighborhoods to collect the dead. Bells tolled so often that they lost their power to mark individual loss. In rural villages, where resources were scarcer, bodies might be carried by neighbours or left at the edges of fields until they could be collected. Some accounts suggest that pits were dug in advance, ready to receive dozens of corpses at a time. The emphasis was on speed, not ceremony, for fear that delay would worsen the spread of contagion. The psychological shock of these practices was immense. For medieval Christians, proper burial was essential. To be denied prayers, a shroud, and a marked resting place was to risk spiritual uncertainty. The plague made such denial routine. Families watched loved ones carried off without the rites that had always given meaning to death. In some places, corpses were buried without coffins, without separation, and without names. The very concept of a good death, so carefully cultivated by the Church, collapsed under the weight of numbers. Instead of being guided into eternity by ritual, the dead were shoveled into the ground in anonymity. Even when rituals were performed, they were often hurried or abbreviated. Priests, exhausted or sick themselves, could not keep pace with demand. Records from England describe instances where one blessing was made to cover multiple burials at once. In some towns, new cemeteries had to be consecrated rapidly as existing churchyards overflowed. But the scale of loss made it impossible to provide the kind of careful remembrance that medieval people expected. Entire generations were buried without monuments, leaving gaps in both family memory and parish history. There was also the grim practical problem of space. In crowded urban centres, traditional churchyards filled within weeks. Authorities expanded burial grounds or repurposed land outside city walls, often against prior tradition. Some pits became so large that they were left open for days, half filled with decomposing bodies until new layers could be added. The stench described in multiple accounts hung over entire districts. This sensory reality reinforced the horror. Death was not only seen but smelled and inhaled daily. Despite the speed and anonymity, some communities sought to preserve at least a semblance of dignity. In certain places, mass graves were marked with crosses or memorial stones, acknowledging the dead even if individuals could not be named. Confraternities and religious guilds sometimes took it upon themselves to bury strangers, offering minimal rites where families could not. Yet these gestures were exceptions rather than the rule. The overwhelming pressure of the plague left little room for the customs that once defined communal care for the dead. The long-term consequences of this break with tradition were significant. Survivors carried the memory of unceremonious burials as an open wound. Art and literature of the late Middle Ages often returned to the image of death as sudden, indiscriminate, and stripped of dignity. The Danse Macabre, with its skeletal figures leading kings and peasants alike, reflected a world where the line between noble tombs and mass pits had been blurred. For those who lived through it, the plague had demonstrated that not only could death come quickly, but it could also erase the rituals that gave life closure. In the end, mass graves were the most visible reminder of how the Black Death overwhelmed society. They symbolised both the scale of the disaster and the collapse of cultural norms that had once given death meaning. What execution fires did in public squares, plagues did on a continental scale. They reminded the living that control was fragile, that dignity was not guaranteed, and that death could strip away not just life, but the rituals that made it bearable. Medieval justice was not always content with killing. It often sought to terrify first. Torture was a tool not only to extract confessions, but to stage power, and the psychology of fear frequently mattered as much as, if not more than, the actual pain inflicted. In many cases, the anticipation of torture, or simply the sight of its instruments, was enough to break a prisoner before a single blow was struck. Medieval authorities understood this dynamic well. Dungeons and chambers were often equipped with racks, ropes and devices designed to frighten as much as harm. The accused were brought into these rooms, shown the instruments and told what would be done to them. The mind did much of the work. A prisoner facing the looming sight of an iron chair or a set of pincers could be persuaded to confess long before the torturer laid a hand on them. Chroniclers and legal manuals alike note that many confessions came at this stage, where imagination magnified suffering beyond what might have been inflicted in reality. This psychological edge gave torture its efficiency. Executions alone might instill fear in the public, but torture personalised that fear for the accused. It worked on uncertainty, how much pain would be given, how long it would last, whether survival was even possible. The dread of the unknown often eroded resistance faster than the physical experience itself. For authorities, this was useful. A confession wrung from terror could validate a legal process, even if the reliability of the statement was questionable. Truth mattered less than submission. Fear was also carefully staged in relation to the community. While some torture took place in secret chambers, reports of what had been done circulated widely. People spoke of bodies stretched on racks until joints cracked, or of prisoners forced to endure heat, cold, or crushing weights. These stories spread the terror beyond the dungeon walls, reinforcing the idea that disobedience did not simply risk execution, but the prolonged agony leading up to it. Just as the stake symbolised purification, the rack and other devices symbolised the crushing power of authority to dominate both body and spirit. For the condemned, the weight could be as punishing as the act. Days or weeks of imprisonment before torture allowed fear to ferment. Prisoners lived with the constant awareness that they'd be called at any moment, dragged to chambers where screams of others echoed. Inquisitorial records from the late Middle Ages sometimes describe this process. The accused told they would be subjected to torture the following morning, left awake all night in dread. By dawn, some broke down and confessed before the ropes were tied. It was not necessarily the pain itself that destroyed them, but the mental torment of anticipating it. There is evidence that authorities counted on this. Manuals on judicial procedure often recommended starting with threats and displays, escalating to actual torture only if the accused resisted. This tiered approach maximised psychological effect while minimising the need for sustained physical harm. After all, torture was messy and carried risks of accidental death before formal sentencing. A prisoner cowed into confession by fear alone spared the court both trouble and expense. The broader community absorbed these lessons as well. Tales of torture circulated alongside tales of execution, ensuring that fear took root not only in the dungeons but in daily life. Children grew up hearing warnings that disobedience could lead to the rack. Neighbours whispered about screams heard through prison walls. The devices themselves sometimes became exhibits, shown off as proof of authority's reach. Whether or not most people ever saw torture firsthand, they knew enough to imagine it vividly, and imagination was often the sharper blade. In this way, torture before execution illustrates the central role of psychology in medieval punishment. The pain mattered, but the terror of what might happen mattered more. The dread stripped away resistance, reshaped behaviour and reinforced obedience long before the fire or the gallows finished the work. Where plague and famine showed how fragile human bodies could be, torture reminded medieval people that fear itself was a weapon, and one wielded with calculated precision by those in power. If fear alone often did the work, medieval authorities still kept a full arsenal of devices ready to back up their threats. The very existence of these tools lent credibility to the intimidation, and when deployed, they offered a spectacle of pain that confirmed authorities' control over the body. Some became infamous, like the rack and the wheel, while others, such as the Iron Maiden, were later exaggerated or mythologized. Taken together, they reveal how punishment in the Middle Ages blurred the line between judicial process and calculated cruelty. The rack was among the most notorious. It consisted of a wooden frame with rollers at either end, to which a prisoner's wrists and ankles were tied. By turning the rollers, executioners stretched the body, dislocating joints and tearing muscles. Chroniclers describe limbs lengthened unnaturally, with popping sounds that horrified witnesses. The rack had practical appeal for interrogators. It left few obvious external injuries, but caused agony so intense that prisoners often confessed quickly. Its effectiveness lay in the drawn-out possibility of pain. Each turn of the rollers amplified the torment while leaving the victim alive and able to speak. For this reason, it remained a favourite in inquisitorial settings, where the goal was not just punishment, but extracting usable testimony. The breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel, was a more openly brutal device. Unlike the rack, which worked behind closed doors, the wheel was often part of public execution. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner used an iron bar or hammer to shatter bones methodically. Sometimes the body was woven through the spokes afterward, and displayed for days as a warning to others. This punishment was not only excruciating, but also slow, as victims lingered in agony before dying from shock, blood loss, or exposure. While it may seem gratuitous today, contemporaries viewed it as fitting for severe crimes like murder or treason, crimes that, in the eyes of the law, deserved to erase the body as a symbol of erasing the person. The Iron Maiden is more complicated. Popular imagination envisions it as a coffin-like sarcophagus, lined with spikes that pierced victims when the door closed. In reality, evidence for its widespread medieval use is thin. Most historians now argue that it was a later invention, or at least heavily embellished in the 18th and 19th centuries to dramatise the barbarity of the Middle Ages. That said, spiked chairs, cages and other confinement devices did exist, and they served the same purpose: to make prisoners suffer while restricting their movement. Whether or not the classic Iron Maiden was a genuine medieval tool, its enduring legend reflects how strongly people associated the period with creative cruelty. Other devices filled the gaps between interrogation and punishment. Thumbscrews, for example, crushed fingers or toes with small but excruciating pressure. The strappado involved binding a prisoner's hands behind their back, suspending them by a rope, and then dropping them suddenly to dislocate the shoulders. Chairs studded with iron points forced prisoners to remain seated under threat of piercing. Each device relied less on efficiency and more on terror. They were not designed to kill outright, but to extend suffering long enough to break resistance. What stands out is how these devices combined practicality with symbolism. The rack turned the body into a stretched, distorted version of itself, symbolising the distortion of truth. The wheel shattered the criminal piece by piece, a visible metaphor for the destruction of social order caused by their crime. Even if the Iron Maiden was more legend than fact, its imagined spikes spoke to the association of confinement with torment. The point was always the same. Authority had the means to take apart both body and spirit, slowly and painfully. For ordinary people, knowledge of these tools reinforced obedience. Most would never see the rack or wheel used directly, but stories circulated widely and the names alone carried weight. A threat of the wheel or the rack conjured enough horror to make resistance seem futile. In this sense, the devices functioned even when idle. Their existence was as important as their deployment, since the mere possibility of their use maintained the climate of fear that rulers and inquisitors relied upon. Ultimately, common torture devices reveal the dual function of medieval justice: practical interrogation on the one hand and theatrical intimidation on the other. Whether stretching, breaking or confining, they reminded communities that disobedience carried consequences beyond death. If fear was the sharper weapon, these tools were the props that gave fear its credibility. Pain was not simply private suffering. It was a stage-managed performance that reminded communities who held authority. By using torture publicly, or by allowing news of it to spread, rulers turned individual agony into a collective lesson. Public torture and execution fit into a wider culture of spectacle. Medieval life was already filled with ritual processions, religious festivals and seasonal fairs. Justice slotted into this framework using the same methods of drama and display. The breaking wheel erected in the town square was not just a device but a symbol. It made visible the reach of authority, showing that rulers had the ability to shatter not only bones but also rebellion. The more gruesome the punishment, the more emphatic the message. Crime and disobedience would be crushed piece by piece. Rulers also recognised that torture carried a moral weight. In an age where crime was seen as a sin against God and community, punishment had to be exemplary. By stretching a thief on the rack or displaying a rebel's broken body, authorities reinforced the idea that justice was not only legal, but divine. Chroniclers often echoed this language, describing punishments as purgative, meant to cleanse society of corruption. Just as burning a heretic symbolized purification, torture dramatized the restoration of order. In this sense, the spectacle served both secular and religious ends, uniting crown and church in a shared performance of discipline. The audience was essential to this process. Executions and tortures were scheduled to ensure maximum attendance, sometimes coinciding with market days when crowds were already gathered. People were not only witnesses but participants, encouraged to jeer, pray, or reflect. Parents brought children, ensuring the lesson carried into the next generation. In this way, the pain of one became the instruction of many. The condemned's cries were part of the script, underscoring the consequences of defiance. Of course, not all reactions aligned neatly with authorities' intentions. Some spectators turned the events into entertainment, treating the spectacle as grim theatre rather than solemn warning. Vendors sold food and drink, gossip circulated, and the cruelty of executioners could become a topic of amusement as much as dread. At times, sympathy for the condemned even threatened to flip the message. A victim who endured torture bravely, or who maintained innocence to the end, could become a folk hero in local memory. Rulers therefore walked a fine line. Torture had to be frightening, but not so outrageous that it backfired and inspired pity. Nonetheless, the benefits outweighed the risks. Public torture served as a form of communication in a world without mass media. A burned heretic, a broken thief, or a rebel displayed on a wheel was a visible proclamation that authority was real and immediate. It cut across literacy and class divides. No one needed to read a law code to understand the meaning of a mangled body. Where sermons and edicts could be ignored, the sight of flesh torn and bones splintered carried a message that stuck. In times of crisis, this reliance on spectacle became especially pronounced. After rebellions, rulers often staged mass executions, making examples of leaders through elaborate tortures. The goal was not only to punish, but to prevent future unrest by searing the memory of pain into the public imagination. Similarly, inquisitorial courts used torture against heretics not merely to extract confessions, but to remind entire communities of the danger of deviation. In both cases, the suffering of a few was calculated to stabilize the many. In the end, torture before execution was never just about the individual condemned. It was a carefully choreographed performance of authority, one that used the body as a canvas on which to write messages of obedience and fear. Devices like the rack and the wheel were props. Executioners were actors and the crowd was the audience. The real target was not the prisoner stretched or broken, but the community watching. Fear was the intended legacy. And in that sense, death as spectacle was as much about power as it was about punishment. Among the most unsettling practices of the medieval world was the ordeal by water, an event in which guilt or innocence was supposedly decided by sinking or floating. While torture relied on human actors, the water ordeal claimed to place judgment in the hands of God. In reality, it became yet another terrifying spectacle, one where drowning and suffocation loomed as the cost of proving one's case. The ordeal by water had deep roots, stretching back to early medieval law codes. The logic was straightforward, if grim. A person accused of a serious crime such as theft, witchcraft, or heresy could be bound and cast into a body of water. If the accused sank, they were declared innocent, the water having received them. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the purifying element. Either outcome was dangerous. Sinking often meant drowning before anyone could rescue the accused, while floating was a death sentence in the form of execution afterward. Innocence, in practice, was often as fatal as guilt. This method of trial reflected the medieval worldview in which natural elements were imbued with divine authority. Water, associated with baptism, was believed to be sacred and incorruptible. To float upon it was to be rejected, as though the element itself refused to bear the weight of sin. To sink was to be accepted, cleansed of accusation. While it sounds absurd to modern ears, to medieval communities it seemed logical. God would not allow a guilty person to be vindicated by holy water. The ordeal was often staged as a public event, reinforcing its role as a spectacle of fear. Crowds gathered along riverbanks, ponds, or specially prepared pools to watch as the accused were tied, sometimes with ropes at the waist or under the arms, and lowered into the water. Priests blessed the sight, prayers were recited, and the accused might be urged to confess before being cast in. As with executions, the ritual was carefully structured to give the impression of solemn justice rather than arbitrary cruelty. The fact that the outcome often resulted in death did not trouble authorities, since divine judgment was presumed to be final. Records show that the ordeal was especially common in cases where evidence was lacking. In the absence of witnesses or confessions, courts turned to water as the ultimate arbiter. This was particularly true for accusations of witchcraft. Women suspected of sorcery were sometimes subjected to swimming tests, their hands and feet bound before being thrown into rivers. If they floated, their guilt was considered proven, since witches were believed to have renounced the cleansing power of baptismal water. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned before they could be pulled out. The cruel irony was clear, but the practice persisted for centuries. Not all ordeals ended fatally. In some cases, the accused were quickly hauled out after sinking, pronounced innocent, and released. But even survival did not erase the trauma or the stigma of accusation. To be subjected to the ordeal at all was to endure humiliation before neighbours and family, and many who survived found their reputations permanently damaged. Communities remembered not just the verdict, but the sight of the accused thrashing in the water, a spectacle that reinforced both fear and suspicion. By the later Middle Ages, scepticism about the ordeal grew. Legal reforms and the influence of Roman law emphasised evidence and procedure over ritual tests. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 officially forbade clergy from participating in ordeals, undermining their legitimacy. Yet the practice did not vanish overnight. In rural areas and in witchcraft trials, the ordeal by water lingered well into the early modern period. Its persistence speaks to the enduring fear of unseen crimes and the appeal of letting God decide what humans could not. For the accused, however, the ordeal was anything but divine. It was another form of judicial terror, one that placed lives in the balance of chance and superstition. Whether by drowning in silence or floating to certain condemnation, the outcome rarely favoured the accused. For the community, watching someone struggle in the water reinforced a lesson as old as the wheel or the stake. Justice was not about fairness, but about fear. And water, like fire, could be turned into a weapon of authority. Unlike modern Europe, with its bridges, embankments, and regulated ports, medieval people lived in a world where crossing a river or sailing along the coast carried mortal risk. Shipwrecks and drownings were not rare catastrophes. They were routine hazards that claimed lives year after year. River crossings were among the most common dangers. Bridges were scarce, expensive to build, and often controlled by tolls. Many smaller settlements relied on ferries, essentially wooden boats or rafts pushed along by poles, oars, or ropes. Overloaded ferries capsized easily, particularly during bad weather or when livestock were included in the cargo. Chroniclers mention entire groups of travellers lost at once, swept away after a ferry tipped or ropes snapped. Even strong swimmers stood little chance in cold, fast-moving water, especially when weighed down by clothing. A single misstep on a rain-slicked plank could mean disaster. For merchants and pilgrims, rivers were unavoidable. Pilgrimage routes to shrines like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury often required multiple crossings, each presenting opportunities for accident. Trade caravans carrying wool, wine, or grain faced similar challenges. Goods could be lost with the boat, and so could their owners. In an age when insurance was limited or non-existent, a single river accident could ruin a family financially and remove them physically from the records. It is no coincidence that saints' lives frequently mention miraculous rescues from drowning. Water was such a persistent danger that divine intervention became part of its imagined landscape. Sea voyages were even riskier. The ships of the Middle Ages were small by modern standards, often little more than wooden hulls with limited steering capacity. Navigation relied on experience, coastal landmarks, and a fair amount of luck. Sudden storms, shifting winds, and rocky coastlines spelled frequent disaster. Entire fleets could be lost within hours. Chroniclers recorded with grim regularity how nobles, clerics, or envoys vanished when their vessels sank. The English Channel alone claimed countless victims, including armies caught in storms on their way to campaigns in France. For sailors and passengers alike, death at sea was almost expected. Fishing communities lived with this risk daily. While fishing offered sustenance and trade, the open sea could turn violent quickly. Families on shore often watched anxiously for boats to return, knowing that a sudden squall could mean widows and orphans before nightfall. The precariousness of maritime life bred traditions of blessings, charms, and rituals meant to secure safe passage. Yet for all the prayers, drownings were common, and entire villages bore the scars of repeated losses. Unlike the spectacle of trial by ordeal, these deaths were not meant to send a message, but they did shape culture. Ballads, sermons, and local legends carried reminders of the sea's dangers. Communities sometimes interpreted shipwrecks as divine punishment, especially when prominent figures were among the dead. In 1120, for example, the sinking of the White Ship off the coast of Normandy killed William Adelin, heir to the English throne, and plunged the kingdom into succession crisis. The disaster became not only a tragedy, but a turning point in political history, illustrating how the sea could alter the fate of nations as well as families. River and sea travel, nevertheless, remained essential. Medieval economies relied on waterways to move goods, and pilgrims relied on them to reach shrines. People accepted the risk as part of life, much like the dangers of plague or famine. Still, the frequency of drowning left its mark. Parish records regularly note burials of those lost to water. Grave markers sometimes depicted anchors, ships, or waves, silent acknowledgements of a danger always present. What trial by ordeal dramatized in ritual, rivers and seas enacted in daily reality, the possibility that water would judge who lived and who died. Unlike torture chambers or plague pits, these deaths were not deliberate, but they reinforced the same medieval lesson, that life was precarious and death could come suddenly in a slip of the oar or a shift of the tide. For a society that depended on water for survival, it remained both a lifeline and a lethal force. In the medieval imagination, drowning carried layers of meaning that made it both cleansing and damning, depending on the context. Water was never a neutral element. It was the medium of baptism, the purifier of souls, but also the setting for ordeals, shipwrecks, and deaths that stripped away dignity. To drown was at once to perish in an ordinary accident and to enter into a charged space of spiritual interpretation. Christian teaching gave water an overwhelmingly positive role. Baptism marked the beginning of Christian life, washing away original sin and initiating the believer into the faith. Priests emphasized that water could cleanse both body and soul. This association meant that on one level, drowning could be imagined as a final baptism, a passage into God's presence. Medieval sermons occasionally suggested that those who drowned might be purified by the water that took them. In a world where salvation was constantly on people's minds, this interpretation offered some comfort to families who had lost relatives at sea or in rivers. Yet drowning also carried darker symbolism. The Bible provided multiple precedents for water as a form of divine punishment. The flood in Genesis, the drowning of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, Jonah swallowed by the whale after being cast into the sea. These stories shaped how medieval people interpreted accidents. A sudden death by water could be understood not as random chance, but as judgment. Communities sometimes whispered that those lost in rivers or storms had been punished for hidden sins. This interpretation was especially strong when the victims were prominent figures, as in the case of nobles lost during sea voyages. A shipwreck could be retold as evidence that God's justice had reached even the mighty. The tension between water as cleansing and water as damning created unease. Drowning was unlike death by fire or sword, which left visible remains. Water swallowed bodies, carried them away, or deposited them days later in an unrecognizable state. The inability to recover or properly bury a drowned person unsettled communities. Burial in consecrated ground was central to medieval notions of a good death, and drowning often denied that. Without a grave, families struggled to find closure. Parish priests might still perform rites, but the absence of a body left questions unanswered. Was the soul at rest? Had God accepted or condemned them? Witchcraft accusations further complicated this symbolism. As noted earlier, water was used in ordeals to test suspected witches. Floating meant guilt, sinking meant innocence. The ordeal depended on the assumption that water, as a pure element, rejected the unclean. In this framework, drowning became paradoxical. To sink and die was to be vindicated, but to float and survive was to be condemned. Communities absorbed this logic, reinforcing the idea that drowning was not just physical but spiritual, a sign of how the elements judged the moral worth of a person. Maritime culture layered additional meaning on top. Sailors and fishermen often saw the sea as both provider and destroyer. Rituals before voyages, from sprinkling holy water to invoking saints like Nicholas of Myra, reflected the belief that the ocean was a sacred and dangerous space. When ships went down, survivors often spoke of the sea as hungry or wrathful. Such language echoed theological themes. Water could sustain, but it could also devour. At the same time, stories of miraculous survival circulated. Hagiographies described saints rescuing drowning victims, calming storms, or walking on water. These tales reassured believers that divine power could overrule the dangers of water. They also reinforced the sense that drowning was not merely an accident, but a site where the divine and human intersected. Every immersion carried spiritual stakes. By the later Middle Ages, legal and religious authorities increasingly stressed the need to interpret drowning carefully. Canon lawyers debated whether those who died in shipwrecks had received the sacraments properly. Preachers used stories of drownings in sermons as moral warnings, urging repentance before sudden death overtook the unprepared. Artists even depicted skeletons dragging the living into rivers or seas, a reminder that water could symbolize death itself. In the end, the symbolism of drowning reflected the broader medieval outlook on life, precarious, unpredictable, and constantly read through a spiritual lens. To fall into water was not only to risk suffocation, but to enter into a realm charged with meaning. It might cleanse like baptism, or it might condemn like the flood. For medieval people, the ambiguity was itself terrifying. Unlike fire, which was consistently purifying yet painful, water carried too many messages at once. It was life-giving and life-taking, saving and damning. To die by drowning was therefore not just an accident of circumstance, but a death heavy with spiritual uncertainty, a fate that left survivors anxious about what it meant for both body and soul. Starvation was not a quick judgment of water or fire, but a lingering erosion of strength that could stretch across months or even years. At its root lay the fragility of medieval agriculture. Crops depended almost entirely on the weather, and when the weather failed, entire villages faced the prospect of hunger. Crop failures and harsh winters were not occasional inconveniences. They were recurring crises that shaped how people understood both nature and survival. The medieval economy rested on grain, wheat where the soil was rich, rye and oats in poorer regions. Grain was the foundation of bread, the staple food for nearly everyone. But cereal crops were highly sensitive to climate. Too much rain and seeds rotted in the ground. Too little and harvests shriveled. A wet summer could ruin hay meant for livestock, leaving animals to starve and depriving families of both milk and meat. A harsh winter might freeze the ground before planting or kill off seedlings before spring. Agricultural technology offered little buffer. Without fertilizers, irrigation, or modern storage, peasants lived at the mercy of the sky. When crops failed, the effects rippled quickly. Food stores dwindled, and what little remained became more expensive. Markets reflected the panic of scarcity, with prices doubling or tripling within weeks. Families that normally subsisted on modest bread and pottage suddenly found even those basics out of reach. Chroniclers note people stretching flour with bark, acorns or ground-up roots, creating loaves that filled the stomach but provided little nourishment. These substitutes often caused digestive problems, leaving the weak even more vulnerable. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 illustrates how devastating a few bad seasons could be. Beginning with torrential rains that ruined crops across northern Europe, the disaster spiralled as fields remained waterlogged for years. Grain sprouted mould in storage barns, livestock sickened from damp conditions, and salt, essential for preserving meat and fish, became scarce because mines flooded. Chroniclers describe scenes of utter desperation. Horses and dogs butchered for food, seeds eaten instead of sown, and parents abandoning children they could no longer feed. Mortality soared, not only from hunger itself, but from diseases that preyed on malnourished bodies. Villages were particularly vulnerable because they lived so close to subsistence. A bad harvest in one year could sometimes be managed by drawing on reserves or borrowing from neighbours. But repeated failures stripped away these coping strategies. Rural communities had little access to distant markets, and transport networks were too primitive to bring large quantities of grain quickly. Even if supplies existed in another region, the cost of moving them made them unreachable to the poor. As a result, one unlucky season could tip a community into starvation, and a series of unlucky seasons could wipe it out entirely. Famine also exposed the limits of lordly and royal protection. In theory, rulers had a duty to safeguard their people, but in practice they often lacked the resources to provide meaningful relief. Grain hoarding by landlords was common, and efforts at price control rarely reached the poorest. Some towns attempted to regulate bread prices or distribute emergency rations, but corruption and limited supplies undercut these efforts. For many peasants, survival came down not to official aid, but to desperate improvisation, eating weeds, stripping tree bark, or raiding storehouses when hunger overwhelmed fear of punishment. Harsh winters compounded these crises. Rivers froze, cutting off transport, and livestock perished in barns without fodder. Firewood grew scarce, leaving households unable to cook what little food they had. Chroniclers sometimes describe entire villages sitting in silence during these seasons, too weak to work the fields or care for animals. Spring, normally a time of renewal, could become a season of death if the seed corn had been eaten the year before and fields lay empty. The slowness of famine made it especially cruel. Unlike plague or drowning, which killed swiftly, starvation hollowed people out gradually. Bodies weakened, immune systems collapsed, and minor illnesses became fatal. Social bonds frayed as families competed for scraps, and theft increased despite harsh punishments. Hunger gnawed not only at the body but at trust and dignity. It was a communal crisis, but it forced individuals into lonely choices. For medieval people, the lesson was stark. Survival depended on forces they could not control, and a few seasons of bad weather could erase generations of labour. Crop failures and harsh winters turned the landscape itself into an enemy. If fire symbolised punishment and water symbolised uncertainty, famine symbolised helplessness, a slow reminder that nature, not man, dictated who lived and who starved. If bad harvests and brutal winters set the stage for famine, the slow death of hunger was the performance no one wanted to watch. Starvation rarely killed outright in a matter of days. Instead, it advanced gradually, grinding people down over weeks or months until their bodies and minds were hollowed out. Unlike plague or execution, where death arrived suddenly and dramatically, famine's cruelty lay in its drawn-out erosion of life. For medieval communities, this made hunger not only physically devastating, but also emotionally corrosive. The body weakened in predictable stages. With insufficient calories, people first experienced fatigue and dizziness. Work in the fields or workshops became impossible. Even walking long distances drained energy. Muscles wasted away, skin grew pale and dry, and wounds that might normally heal lingered or became infected. As malnutrition worsened, immune systems collapsed. Diseases that a healthy body might survive, such as pneumonia or dysentery, turned fatal. Chroniclers note that famine and epidemic often appeared together, one amplifying the other. In this sense, starvation was rarely a solitary killer. It opened the door for others to finish the job. Children suffered most. Their smaller bodies and higher nutritional needs made them particularly vulnerable. Records from famines in the 14th and 15th centuries show spikes in child mortality, with infants abandoned or quietly buried when parents could no longer feed them. Some families chose to give up their youngest in the hope of saving the older, stronger children. Others turned children out to beg in towns where they might survive on charity. These choices were desperate and heartbreaking, but they reflect the brutal arithmetic of famine. Not everyone could be saved. Adults faced their own toll. Parents often sacrificed their share of food for their children, weakening themselves to the point of collapse. Husbands and wives quarrelled as resources dwindled, with accusations of hoarding or favouritism. Theft rose sharply, not only against strangers, but within households. Social cohesion broke down under the pressure. Villagers who once shared resources in lean times now locked their doors, fearing that generosity would mean starvation for their own families. The emotional strain was just as damaging as the physical. Hunger gnawed at patience and hope. Chroniclers describe communities descending into despair, where daily life consisted of little more than searching for scraps. Traditional routines, feasts, festivals, even church attendance, waned as people lacked the strength or will to participate. Priests preached repentance, urging people to see famine as divine punishment. But these sermons often deepened guilt rather than offered comfort. For those already weakened, the suggestion that starvation reflected moral failure only added to the suffering. Mental effects of prolonged hunger were noted too. People became irritable, paranoid, or lethargic. Chroniclers describe villagers staring blankly, unable to muster energy even for conversation. Some grew reckless, raiding granaries or attacking travellers despite the certainty of punishment if caught. Others clung to rumours of miracle cures or secret hoards, wasting precious energy chasing false hope. In this way, famine warped not only bodies but also the social fabric of entire regions. One of the most disturbing aspects of prolonged hunger was its ability to normalise misery. As months dragged on, families became accustomed to watching neighbours waste away. Starvation shifted from an emergency to a grim routine. By the second or third year of a famine, entire communities often seemed resigned to loss. Survivors carried on with skeletal frames and hollow eyes, too preoccupied with survival to grieve properly for the dead. This numb acceptance may have helped people endure, but it also left lasting scars. In historical hindsight, the slow death of hunger illustrates the particular cruelty of famine compared to other medieval terrors. Plague was swift, fire spectacular, drowning ambiguous. Starvation, by contrast, was an ordeal of waiting, knowing death was coming, but not when, and feeling every step of the decline. For medieval people, this made famine one of the most feared fates. It stripped away not only flesh and strength, but also dignity, compassion, and hope. It was death stretched out across time, a slow reminder that survival depended less on human will than on the unpredictable mercy of the seasons. Chroniclers, who rarely shied away from grim details, recorded stories of cannibalism during Europe's worst famines. These were not everyday occurrences, but their very mention shows the extremes to which hunger pushed some communities. In a society where food was already tied to morality, eating human flesh was the ultimate marker of despair, an act both condemned and, in some cases, quietly understood as the last resort of the dying. The Great Famine of 1317 provides the clearest examples. Heavy rains had ruined harvests, livestock had perished, and salt for preserving fish and meat had become scarce. Contemporary accounts describe people scouring fields for weeds, boiling nettles and bark, and eating animals that were normally shunned, such as horses, dogs, and even vermin. Chroniclers then note the darkest turn. In some regions, starving peasants allegedly resorted to digging up corpses or preying on travellers. One English chronicler wrote with horror that men and women ate the flesh of their own children. Whether exaggerated or not, these reports captured the sense that hunger had reduced people to a level beyond recognition. Other famines produced similar tales. In France, Germany, and the Low Countries, accounts mention roadside murders followed by grisly meals. In one case, from Flanders, villagers were said to have hung executed criminals not for deterrence, but for sustenance. These stories were often framed in moralising tones, portraying cannibalism as proof that society had fallen under divine punishment. Yet it is telling that chroniclers repeated them, suggesting they struck contemporaries as plausible. Everyone knew how hunger distorted judgment, and even if the details were embellished, the underlying truth was that famine forced people into unimaginable choices. The taboo of cannibalism was sharpened by the religious significance of food. In Christian belief, the Eucharist symbolized the body of Christ consumed sacramentally. This sacred act made the idea of literally eating human flesh all the more horrific. To cross that line was to invert the holiest ritual of the church. Chroniclers understood this and used cannibalism stories to emphasize the spiritual degradation of famine. Hunger did not just kill, it stripped away the thin layer of civilization that separated humans from beasts. At the same time, there is reason to think that some reports contained kernels of truth. Archaeological studies of famine sites have uncovered bones with cut marks consistent with butchery. Written records also occasionally mention executions for cannibalism, suggesting authorities took the threat seriously. In extreme situations, particularly in besieged towns where supplies ran out, cannibalism was not just rumour, but grim reality. Medieval people may have recoiled at the idea, but they also recognised it as a possibility when hunger left no alternatives. Even when literal cannibalism did not occur, the fear of it haunted famine-stricken communities. Parents dreaded being forced into impossible choices. Travellers avoided strangers on the road, worried that desperation might turn them into prey. Priests preached sermons warning against such sin, but the very need for those sermons suggests the temptation was real. Cannibalism stories thus functioned as both cautionary tales and acknowledgements of famine's worst outcome, the collapse of every social and moral restraint. For survivors, the memory of such rumours was lasting. Chroniclers of later centuries continued to invoke the Great Famine's horrors as a warning, repeating the tales of human flesh consumed in desperation. These stories reinforced the association of famine with moral breakdown, painting hunger not just as a physical ordeal, but as a threat to the very fabric of Christian society. When people starved, the line between human and inhuman blurred, and the community's identity fractured. In the end, cannibalism during famine may have been rare, but the fact that it appeared in chronicles at all demonstrates how deeply it frightened medieval people. It stood as the ultimate symbol of desperation when the slow death of hunger tipped into madness and taboo. If fire and water had offered spectacular punishments, famine's horror lay in its ability to reduce people to choices that horrified even themselves. To medieval observers, there could be no clearer sign that famine was not merely a natural disaster but a divine judgment, one that consumed not only the body but also the very idea of what it meant to be human. Medieval warfare was not only about banners, castles and noble glory, it was also about the brutality of close combat, where hacked limbs, shattered skulls and crushing armour defined the reality of death. Chroniclers and poets often dressed war in the language of honour, but beneath that veneer lay carnage that spared neither soldier nor peasant caught in its path. The weapons themselves dictated much of this brutality. Swords, axes and maces were designed for maximum damage, not finesse. A sword stroke might slice through flesh and bone, leaving wounds that festered even if they did not kill outright. Axes and polearms delivered crushing blows, capable of splitting helmets or severing limbs. Maces and warhammers, blunt but devastating, were intended to smash through chainmail or dent plate armour, often reducing the skull beneath to pulp. Unlike modern combat fought at a distance, medieval battle required men to face each other within arm's reach, striking until one side collapsed. Armour, though protective, introduced its own risks. A knight in full mail or plate might survive an initial blow, only to be crushed under the weight of his gear if he fell. Accounts from battles like Crécy or Agincourt describe muddy fields littered with heavily armoured men who suffocated after being knocked down, unable to rise. Others drowned in shallow streams or trampled under the boots of their own retreating comrades. The very equipment designed to keep a soldier alive could become a trap in the chaos of the fight. The battlefield was also an environment where order quickly gave way to frenzy. Even when armies lined up with banners flying, formations soon broke down into individual struggles. Chroniclers describe melees where soldiers hacked wildly, swinging at any figure within reach. The noise, clashing steel, shouting and the screams of the wounded added to the confusion. Death was rarely clean. Limbs were severed, faces mutilated and guts spilled onto the ground. Surgeons who followed the armies had little to offer beyond crude amputations, cauterization with hot irons, or herbal salves. Infection killed far more than the initial blow. For the common soldier, the risks were immense. Knights and nobles might be ransomed if captured, but ordinary footmen had no such value. Defeat often meant slaughter. Chroniclers of the 100 Years' War note that peasants pressed into service died in droves, either cut down in the battle or executed afterward. Even those who survived often carried disfiguring wounds that ended their ability to work, reducing them to beggary. War did not merely kill. It produced a population of maimed and broken men who haunted the margins of medieval society. Civilians were not spared, either. When armies clashed near villages, bystanders could be caught in the violence. Pillaging, rape, and the burning of homes were common, justified as the spoils of war or as punishment for supporting the enemy. For those who had endured famine or plague, the arrival of soldiers meant yet another terror. Death, not from hunger or sickness, but from the edge of a blade. The psychological toll of battlefield deaths was significant as well. Chroniclers sometimes marvelled at the courage of knights who fought to the last breath, but they also admitted the horror of mutilated corpses strewn across the field. After major battles, bodies might remain unburied for days, picked over by scavengers or left to rot in the open. Survivors had to march past the corpses of comrades and enemies alike, carrying the memory of what steel and iron could do to flesh. Ultimately, battlefield deaths highlight the contrast between war's idealized image and its grim reality. Songs and chronicles celebrated victory, honor, and divine favor, but the men who fought knew another truth, that war was chaos where limbs were hacked off, armor became a coffin, and survival was often a matter of sheer luck. Compared to famine's slow wasting or plague's sudden fever, the battlefield offered a more immediate but no less horrifying reminder of mortality. In every clash of swords and crash of armour, medieval people were reminded that human hands could be just as destructive as any act of God. Hanging was the most common form of capital punishment in medieval Europe, and unlike the unpredictable slaughter of combat, it was carefully staged to demonstrate authority and control. Yet for the condemned, the experience could be every bit as brutal as a sword stroke on the field, and often far slower. Whether death came quickly or dragged on for minutes depended less on design than on chance, making the gallows both feared and grimly uncertain. The mechanics of medieval hanging were crude by modern standards. The long drop in which a prisoner fell far enough to break the neck instantly was not widely adopted until the 19th century. In the Middle Ages, executions more often involved what historians call the short drop, or suspension. The condemned stood on a cart, ladder or stool, and once it was pulled away, their body was left to strangle under its own weight. Death could take several minutes. Some struggled violently, clawing at the rope, while others twitched and convulsed until their bodies finally went limp. The uncertainty of how long it would take was part of the punishment. A sword blow might kill in seconds, but the gallows could make death an ordeal. Social status determined who faced the noose. Hanging was considered a commoner's death, reserved for thieves, murderers, rebels, and anyone of low birth who had crossed the law. Nobles, by contrast, were more likely to be beheaded, a swifter and, importantly, more honourable fate. This distinction underscored the gallows' role as both punishment and humiliation. To die hanging before a crowd marked a person not only as a criminal, but as socially degraded, their swinging body a warning to others of similar rank. Public display was essential. Gallows were often erected on hills or crossroads where they could be seen from a distance. After execution, bodies were sometimes left dangling for days, serving as grim signposts to travellers and locals alike. In some cases, the corpses were eventually removed and buried, but in others they were deliberately left to rot, scavenged by birds. This extended exposure turned hanging into more than a method of killing. It became a form of posthumous shaming, erasing any dignity the condemned might have retained. Hanging also carried legal and symbolic weight. In many jurisdictions, gallows were permanent structures, representing the authority of the lord or the town. To have the right of the gallows, sometimes called the right of high justice, was a marker of power. Lords who erected gallows on their land demonstrated not only that they could punish, but that they had jurisdiction over life and death. The presence of a gallows on the skyline was as much a deterrent as the act of execution itself. The uncertainty of the noose, however, made it particularly cruel. While some died swiftly from shock or airway constriction, others lingered in agony. Chroniclers occasionally note the intervention of family members or sympathetic onlookers who pulled down on the legs of the condemned to hasten death. Conversely, executioners sometimes manipulated the rope to prolong the spectacle, ensuring that the crowd witnessed a drawn-out struggle. Either outcome reinforced the gallows' reputation as a punishment that could humiliate as well as kill. For the community, hangings functioned as public lessons. Crowds gathered to watch, jeer, or sometimes pity the condemned. Just as with torture or burning, the emotional climax came in the prisoner's final words. Some confessed, begging forgiveness and warning others not to follow their path. Others cursed the authorities, defiantly maintaining innocence. Whatever was said, it was absorbed by the audience and retold afterward, shaping memory of the event. A defiant speech could make a martyr. A broken confession could confirm the justice of the sentence. In comparison to battlefield deaths, hanging lacked the chaos of combat, but it carried its own horror. A slow, uncertain suffocation framed by humiliation and public exposure. It reminded communities that justice was not only about punishment, but also about hierarchy. Nobles could expect the clean blade of the axe, while ordinary men and women dangled in the open air, their bodies turned into warnings. If the battlefield revealed mortality through steel and mud, the gallows revealed it through rope and spectacle, a fate both common and dreaded in equal measure. In medieval Europe, the axe or the sword was not just a killing tool, but a marker of social distinction. Nobles, knights, and high-ranking clergy accused of crimes could expect to meet their end on the block rather than the gallows. The difference was not trivial. To die by hanging was to be disgraced publicly, body swinging like a criminal's. To die by the axe was to acknowledge guilt, but in a way that preserved honour, family reputation, and the dignity of rank. For many nobles, the fear of losing that privilege outweighed even the fear of death itself. The logic behind this distinction lay in medieval social hierarchy. Justice was not designed to be equal. It reflected and reinforced status. Nobles held privileges in life, and those extended into death. Beheading was seen as quicker and more civilized, avoiding the indignities of strangulation or burning. It was also framed as more merciful, sparing the condemned prolonged suffering. That mercy, however, was not offered to commoners. For them, the noose or the stake served as reminders of their lower place in society. By contrast, the axe proclaimed that even in disgrace, a noble remained separate from the masses. Execution by beheading also carried ceremonial weight. Unlike hangings, which could take place at crossroads or gallows fields, beheadings often occurred at central or symbolic sites, castles, town squares, or specially prepared scaffolds. The condemned were frequently given the chance to speak, to settle affairs, or to display courage before the blade fell. Chroniclers paid close attention to these final moments, recording whether the victim met death calmly or with trembling. A composed death could enhance a family's reputation, proving that their bloodline retained dignity even in punishment. The danger, of course, was that beheading did not always go smoothly. Executioners were not always skilled, and a poorly aimed stroke could turn a supposedly merciful death into a gruesome ordeal. Accounts exist of nobles struck 2, 3, or even more times before death was achieved. The embarrassment was as memorable as the crime itself. This risk added to the drama of the occasion. Everyone hoped for a clean cut, but the possibility of failure hung over the scene. In that sense, the axe was not only a tool of justice, but also a test of the executioner's competence and the condemned's composure. Beheading was particularly tied to treason, a crime viewed as both political and symbolic. When nobles rebelled against their king or betrayed their oaths, their deaths had to be public enough to reaffirm authority, but dignified enough to acknowledge their rank. The famous case of Thomas More in 1535, though later than the High Middle Ages, illustrates how beheading became a stage for conscience. More's calm acceptance of his fate reinforced the idea that a noble could preserve honour even in death. Earlier examples, like William Wallace in 1305, show how the privilege could be denied to rebels. Wallace was hanged, drawn and quartered rather than granted the axe, underlining that he was treated as a traitor without honour. Women of high status sometimes faced beheading as well, reinforcing its association with rank. Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536, again outside the medieval period but in continuity with it, shows the gendered dimensions. Rather than the axe, she was granted the sword, considered quicker and less brutal. Earlier medieval queens and noblewomen, when condemned, were far more likely to face confinement or exile than execution. But when death was decreed, the axe or sword signalled that their bloodline mattered. The prestige of beheading also extended beyond the act itself to the treatment of the body. Nobles' remains were often returned to their families for burial in consecrated ground, sometimes even in elaborate tombs. This contrasted sharply with the bodies of hanged criminals left to rot or buried in unhallowed earth. Death by axe, therefore, ensured not only a less humiliating execution, but also a more dignified afterlife in memory and ritual. For medieval nobility, then, the real fear was not death, but disgrace. To be stripped of privilege and condemned to the gallows meant a fall from status greater than any physical pain. Beheading preserved at least a measure of control over reputation, allowing condemned nobles to die as members of their class, rather than as criminals. In a society where honour, lineage and appearance mattered profoundly, this distinction could mean everything. Death by the sword or axe was still death, but it was death with status, and that made it preferable to the rope's shameful sway. In an age of thatched roofs, timber beams and open hearths, flames could consume entire streets in a matter of hours. Unlike battlefield deaths or gallows justice, urban fires were not planned events but accidents waiting to happen, sparked by carelessness or bad luck. For medieval towns packed tightly with wooden buildings, fire was as inevitable as it was unstoppable, and few disasters terrified city populations more. The construction of towns made them especially vulnerable. Houses stood close together, often leaning inward over narrow lanes. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, both highly flammable materials. Inside, homes relied on open fires for cooking, heating and light. Chimneys were rare in the early Middle Ages, and sparks easily caught on rafters or thatching. Add to this the presence of workshops, blacksmiths with forges, bakers with ovens, brewers with boiling vats, and every town was riddled with fire hazards. A single accident could spread with terrifying speed. Chroniclers regularly recorded such disasters. In 1137, much of York was destroyed when flames leapt from house to house. London, with its dense sprawl, suffered repeated fires. One in 1212 was said to have killed thousands when flames trapped people on London Bridge. Paris endured similar conflagrations, where whole quarters of timber buildings were reduced to ash in a single night. Smaller towns were no safer. A stray candle in a barn or a tipped brazier in a workshop could leave an entire community homeless by dawn. The speed of spread was astonishing. Thatched roofs ignited quickly, and wind carried burning debris across narrow alleys to start new blazes. Firefighters in the medieval sense did not exist. Neighbours formed bucket chains, throwing water from wells or rivers, but these efforts rarely contained more than small blazes. Larger fires could only be stopped by tearing down adjacent houses, creating fire breaks at the cost of more destruction. In practice, this meant that once a fire began in earnest, communities often had little choice but to watch helplessly as it consumed street after street. The impact went beyond physical loss. Fires destroyed not only homes but also food stores, tools and trade goods. For artisans and merchants, this meant the collapse of livelihoods. Grain reserves turned to ash and wooden chests of cloth or furs were ruined. Churches and monasteries filled with books, relics and treasures were vulnerable as well. Chroniclers lamented the destruction of holy sites, interpreting such fires as signs of divine wrath. For ordinary people, the meaning was simpler. Years of labour could vanish in a single night, leaving families destitute. Urban authorities did attempt to mitigate the risk. Some towns passed regulations requiring stone or tile roofs for certain buildings, especially after major fires. London issued ordinances in the 13th century mandating fire watches at night and limiting the use of thatch. Paris tried to regulate bakeries and forges, recognising their high risk. Yet enforcement was patchy, and the cost of safer materials put them out of reach for most households. As a result, wooden towns persisted well into the later Middle Ages, ensuring that the danger remained. The human cost of fire was not just measured in deaths, but in displacement. Survivors often camped outside city walls, huddling in tents or makeshift shelters. Appeals for aid were sent to lords, bishops, or monarchs, who sometimes provided timber or grain to help rebuild. Rebuilding itself could take years, and in the meantime, charred ruins stood as stark reminders of vulnerability. Communities lived with the knowledge that another spark could undo everything again. For medieval city dwellers, then, fire was the constant shadow of urban life. Unlike executions or famine, it was not limited to criminals or unlucky harvests, but threatened everyone. No rank or wealth guaranteed safety when flames leapt from roof to roof. If the battlefield reminded people of war's brutality, and the gallows reminded them of justice's reach, fire reminded them of the fragility of their homes and the speed with which everything familiar could turn to ash. Among the many illnesses that haunted medieval towns, none carried the same weight of stigma as leprosy. Unlike the sudden fevers of plague, leprosy advanced gradually, reshaping the body in visible ways that set sufferers apart from their neighbours. To contract it was not merely to face illness, but to endure what many contemporaries called a living death, marked by exile, shame, and the erosion of social bonds. Medieval people used the word leprosy broadly, applying it to a range of skin conditions, from psoriasis to advanced cases of Hansen's disease. Whatever the exact diagnosis, what mattered most was how society responded. The disease was feared less for its actual contagion, still poorly understood, than for its unmistakable visibility. Lesions, disfigurement, and the gradual wasting of flesh turned the sufferer's body into a public sign of illness. In towns where crowded streets already made contagion a constant fear, leprosy became a symbol of pollution, both physical and moral. The church played a central role in shaping this stigma. Biblical passages associated leprosy with impurity and divine punishment, and medieval sermons reinforced these themes. Lepers were often treated as though they carried not just disease but sin itself. In some cases, formal rituals of exclusion were performed, where a priest would declare the afflicted person dead to the world, even sprinkling them with earth as though burying them alive. This symbolic death cut them off from the community, sometimes even from their families. They were not executed, but their lives were reduced to shadows of participation. Exile followed. Many towns forced lepers to live outside city walls, establishing leper houses on the margins of society. Some were charitable institutions, providing food, shelter, and limited medical care, often under the supervision of religious orders. Yet even here, the separation was absolute. Lepers were expected to wear distinctive clothing, often hoods, special tunics, or bells, to mark their condition. The bell, in particular, symbolised their exclusion, warning others of their approach. In bustling marketplaces or crowded streets, the sound announced the presence of someone who was simultaneously pitied and shunned. Daily life for lepers was a paradox. They were feared and avoided, yet Christian teaching also urged charity toward them. Wealthy patrons sometimes endowed leper houses, framing their donations as acts of piety. Towns allowed lepers to beg, granting them rights to collect alms as compensation for their exclusion. Still, the reality was bleak. Begging marked them as dependents, and their visible disfigurements made them objects of morbid fascination. In effect, they survived only by embracing the very stigma that had destroyed their independence. The emotional toll of such a life must have been immense. Chroniclers rarely give voice to the afflicted themselves, but the rituals of exclusion speak volumes. To be declared symbolically dead, banished from family life, and forced to live in perpetual separation meant losing not only health, but identity. Medieval society treated lepers as reminders of mortality and divine judgment, living warnings of what could happen to anyone who fell out of favour with God, or simply out of luck. Despite the fear, leprosy was not universally hopeless. Some lepers retained roles in their communities, particularly if their condition was mild. Others joined religious confraternities of lepers, creating their own support networks and even participating in certain rituals. Archaeological evidence suggests that many leprosaria provided decent living conditions, with chapels, gardens, and structured routines. Yet the stigma remained. To be labelled a leper was to carry a mark that no act of devotion or charity could erase. For city dwellers, the sight of lepers on the margins reinforced the fragility of their own place in society. Fires reminded them their homes could vanish in hours. Lepers reminded them that their status could vanish just as quickly. Disease in medieval towns was not always fast and catastrophic like plague. Sometimes it was slow, visible and humiliating, a form of death in life that stripped people of community long before it stripped them of breath. Medieval towns, with their crowded streets, open sewers and limited sanitation, provided ideal breeding grounds for a whole catalogue of invisible killers. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox, influenza and countless unnamed fevers that swept through populations without mercy. These epidemics did not always match the scale of the Black Death, but they haunted urban life with relentless regularity, cutting into populations year after year. Dysentery was among the most common. Caused by contaminated food and water, it spread easily in towns where waste disposal was rudimentary. Latrines often emptied into rivers or ditches that also supplied drinking water. The result was predictable: outbreaks of violent diarrhea, dehydration and death, particularly among children and the elderly. Chroniclers mention entire households stricken, unable to care for one another as they weakened from constant illness. For poorer families who lacked access to relatively clean wells, dysentery could feel like an annual visitor, thinning their ranks before winter hunger set in. Typhus was another dreaded affliction, spread by lice that thrived in unwashed clothing and bedding. In crowded cities, especially during wartime or famine when refugees packed into cramped quarters, lice multiplied rapidly. Typhus produced high fevers, rashes and delirium. Victims often raved before death, a detail that gave the disease an almost supernatural aura. Armies were particularly vulnerable. Whole campaigns collapsed when typhus swept through camps. But civilians were no safer. A single outbreak could kill thousands in weeks, leaving survivors to burn infested bedding and clothing in desperate attempts to stop the spread. Smallpox, though better known in later centuries, also made its presence felt in the Middle Ages. Its high fever and blistering pustules disfigured survivors and killed many of the weak. Unlike dysentery or typhus, smallpox left permanent marks: pitted scars, blindness, or damaged skin that branded the living long after epidemics ended. Families might survive famine only to lose children to this cruel disease, or watch loved ones survive only to carry visible reminders of their ordeal. In a society already obsessed with the visible signs of sin and sickness, smallpox survivors bore both a burden and proof of survival. Influenza and other respiratory fevers rounded out the picture. Medieval medical writers referred vaguely to epidemic catarrhs or pestilential fevers that swept across regions in waves. These were likely influenza or other viral outbreaks. Sudden coughs, fevers and body aches incapacitated entire communities, often during harsh winters when nutrition was already poor. Deaths were high among the elderly, and even survivors were left weakened, prone to pneumonia or other complications. Chroniclers sometimes lumped these epidemics together with plague, unable to distinguish their causes but keenly aware of their effects. What made these epidemics especially terrifying was their invisibility. Unlike leprosy, which marked its victims with visible lesions, or plague, which produced dramatic buboes, dysentery and typhus often began with symptoms indistinguishable from minor ailments. By the time communities recognized an epidemic, it had already spread. Medieval medicine had no way to identify microbes, and treatments, herbal tonics, bleeding or purging rarely helped. The randomness of survival deepened the fear. Two people might drink from the same well, sleep in the same bed, or live in the same household, yet only one succumbed. To contemporaries, this felt less like biology and more like divine judgment. The social impact was immense. Outbreaks disrupted trade, emptied markets, and closed schools and churches. Parents hesitated to send children into crowded streets, and travellers feared lodging in inns where lice or contaminated food might lurk. Epidemics also compounded other disasters. During famines, weakened bodies were easy prey for disease. During sieges, cramped defenders fell victim to dysentery and typhus long before enemy swords reached them. In some cases, disease killed more than battle or hunger combined. For medieval city dwellers, epidemics were a constant reminder of fragility. Fires might destroy homes, leprosy might exile neighbours, but dysentery, typhus and other fevers struck without warning, sweeping away families in days. They were silent killers, invisible and inescapable, flourishing in the very conditions that made cities prosper: crowds, trade, and close human contact. Unlike the slow wasting of leprosy or the spectacle of plague, these diseases were quieter but no less deadly, threading themselves into the background of medieval urban life. In the end, the crowded medieval city was as dangerous as it was vital. Fires could erase entire neighbourhoods in an evening. Leprosy could mark the unlucky with lifelong exile, and epidemics could sweep through streets unseen, leaving only graves and unanswered questions. Where plague and famine offered the terror of scale, these smaller but frequent killers offered the terror of unpredictability. They reminded townsfolk daily that death did not need to arrive with flames or buboes. It could come quietly, carried in water, lice, or breath, without ever showing its face. Fire might consume homes, plague might take whole streets, famine might starve villages, but for many people the true terror began after the last breath. The Church taught that death was not an ending, but a gateway to judgment. And beyond judgment lay either the bliss of heaven or the torments of hell. No earthly pain, however sharp, could rival the imagined horrors of eternal fire, demons, and unending punishment. Medieval sermons, artwork, and literature made sure this fear stayed vivid. Parish priests preached frequently on the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, and the emphasis fell heavily on the dangers of sin. The afterlife was not abstract theology, it was presented as an immediate threat. Parishioners were told that a single unconfessed sin could condemn them forever, and that hell's torments would be infinitely worse than anything they might endure in life. In towns already familiar with plague pits and public executions, the idea of endless fire resonated strongly. It provided not only comfort for the righteous, but also a powerful tool for discipline. The imagery of hellfire was especially effective because it echoed familiar experiences. People knew what it felt like to be burned by a cooking pot, scorched by a forge, or singed by a house fire. Preachers expanded on those sensations, urging listeners to imagine them multiplied beyond comprehension and endured without relief for eternity. Manuscripts and church paintings reinforced the message, depicting demons with pitchforks, cauldrons filled with the damned, and rivers of flame. For an illiterate population, these images carried the weight of undeniable truth. A villager staring at a mural of writhing souls in hell did not need theological training to understand the warning. The speed of spread was astonishing. Thatched roofs ignited quickly, and wind carried burning debris across narrow alleys to start new blazes. Firefighters in the medieval sense did not exist. Neighbours formed bucket chains, throwing water from wells or rivers, but these efforts rarely contained more than small blazes. Larger fires could only be stopped by tearing down adjacent houses, creating fire breaks at the cost of more destruction. In practice, this meant that once a fire began in earnest, communities often had little choice but to watch helplessly as it consumed street after street. The impact went beyond physical loss. Fires destroyed not only homes but also food stores, tools and trade goods. For artisans and merchants, this meant the collapse of livelihoods. Grain reserves turned to ash, and wooden chests of cloth or furs were ruined. Churches and monasteries filled with books, relics and treasures were vulnerable as well. Chroniclers lamented the destruction of holy sites, interpreting such fires as signs of divine wrath. For ordinary people, the meaning was simpler. Years of labour could vanish in a single night, leaving families destitute. Urban authorities did attempt to mitigate the risk. Some towns passed regulations requiring stone or tile roofs for certain buildings, especially after major fires. London issued ordinances in the 13th century, mandating fire watches at night and limiting the use of thatch. Paris tried to regulate bakeries and forges, recognising their high risk. Yet enforcement was patchy, and the cost of safer materials put them out of reach for most households. As a result, wooden towns persisted well into the later Middle Ages, ensuring that the danger remained. The human cost of fire was not just measured in deaths, but in displacement. Survivors often camped outside city walls, huddling in tents or makeshift shelters. Appeals for aid were sent to lords, bishops or monarchs, who sometimes provided timber or grain to help rebuild. Rebuilding itself could take years, and in the meantime, charred ruins stood as stark reminders of vulnerability. Communities lived with the knowledge that another spark could undo everything again. For medieval city dwellers then, fire was the constant shadow of urban life. Unlike executions or famine, it was not limited to criminals or unlucky harvests, but threatened everyone. No rank or wealth guaranteed safety when flames leapt from roof to roof. If the battlefield reminded people of war's brutality and the gallows reminded them of justice's reach, fire reminded them of the fragility of their homes and the speed with which everything familiar could turn to ash. Among the many illnesses that haunted medieval towns, none carried the same weight of stigma as leprosy. Unlike the sudden fevers of plague, leprosy advanced gradually, reshaping the body in visible ways that set sufferers apart from their neighbours. To contract it was not merely to face illness, but to endure what many contemporaries called a living death, marked by exile, shame, and the erosion of social bonds. Medieval people used the word leprosy broadly, applying it to a range of skin conditions, from psoriasis to advanced cases of Hansen's disease. Whatever the exact diagnosis, what mattered most was how society responded. The disease was feared less for its actual contagion, still poorly understood, than for its unmistakable visibility. Lesions, disfigurement, and the gradual wasting of flesh turned the sufferer's body into a public sign of illness. In towns where crowded streets already made contagion a constant fear, leprosy became a symbol of pollution, both physical and moral. The Church played a central role in shaping this stigma. Biblical passages associated leprosy with impurity and divine punishment, and medieval sermons reinforced these themes. Lepers were often treated as though they carried not just disease but sin itself. In some cases, formal rituals of exclusion were performed, where a priest would declare the afflicted person dead to the world, even sprinkling them with earth as though burying them alive. This symbolic death cut them off from the community, sometimes even from their families. They were not executed, but their lives were reduced to shadows of participation. Exile followed. Many towns forced lepers to live outside city walls, establishing leprosaria, leper houses, on the margins of society. Some were charitable institutions providing food, shelter and limited medical care, often under the supervision of religious orders. Yet even here the separation was absolute. Lepers were expected to wear distinctive clothing, often hoods, special tunics or bells to mark their condition. The bell, in particular, symbolised their exclusion, warning others of their approach. In bustling marketplaces or crowded streets, the sound announced the presence of someone who was simultaneously pitied and shunned. Daily life for lepers was a paradox. They were feared and avoided, yet Christian teaching also urged charity toward them. Wealthy patrons sometimes endowed leper houses, framing their donations as acts of piety. Towns allowed lepers to beg, granting them rights to collect alms as compensation for their exclusion. Still, the reality was bleak. Begging marked them as dependents, and their visible disfigurements made them objects of morbid fascination. In effect, they survived only by embracing the very stigma that had destroyed their independence. The emotional toll of such a life must have been immense. Chroniclers rarely give voice to the afflicted themselves, but the rituals of exclusion speak volumes. To be declared symbolically dead, banished from family life, and forced to live in perpetual separation meant losing not only health but identity. Medieval society treated lepers as reminders of mortality and divine judgment, living warnings of what could happen to anyone who fell out of favour with God, or simply out of luck. Despite the fear, leprosy was not universally hopeless. Some lepers retained roles in their communities, particularly if their condition was mild. Others joined religious confraternities of lepers, creating their own support networks and even participating in certain rituals. Archaeological evidence suggests that many leprosaria provided decent living conditions, with chapels, gardens and structured routines. Yet the stigma remained. To be labelled a leper was to carry a mark that no act of devotion or charity could erase. For city dwellers, the sight of lepers on the margins reinforced the fragility of their own place in society. Fires reminded them their homes could vanish in hours. Lepers reminded them that their status could vanish just as quickly. Disease in medieval towns was not always fast and catastrophic like plague. Sometimes it was slow, visible and humiliating, a form of death in life that stripped people of community long before it stripped them of breath. Medieval towns, with their crowded streets, open sewers and limited sanitation, provided ideal breeding grounds for a whole catalogue of invisible killers: dysentery, typhus, smallpox, influenza, and countless unnamed fevers that swept through populations without mercy. These epidemics did not always match the scale of the Black Death, but they haunted urban life with relentless regularity, cutting into populations year after year. Dysentery was among the most common. Caused by contaminated food and water, it spread easily in towns where waste disposal was rudimentary. Latrines often emptied into rivers or ditches that also supplied drinking water. The result was predictable: outbreaks of violent diarrhea, dehydration and death, particularly among children and the elderly. Chroniclers mention entire households stricken, unable to care for one another as they weakened from constant illness. For poorer families who lacked access to relatively clean wells, dysentery could feel like an annual visitor, thinning their ranks before winter hunger set in. Typhus was another dreaded affliction, spread by lice that thrived in unwashed clothing and bedding. In crowded cities, especially during wartime or famine when refugees packed into cramped quarters, lice multiplied rapidly. Typhus produced high fevers, rashes and delirium. Victims often raved before death, a detail that gave the disease an almost supernatural aura. Armies were particularly vulnerable. Whole campaigns collapsed when typhus swept through camps. But civilians were no safer. A single outbreak could kill thousands in weeks, leaving survivors to burn infested bedding and clothing in desperate attempts to stop the spread. Smallpox, though better known in later centuries, also made its presence felt in the Middle Ages. Its high fever and blistering pustules disfigured survivors and killed many of the weak. Unlike dysentery or typhus, smallpox left permanent marks, pitted scars, blindness, or damaged skin that branded the living long after epidemics ended. Families might survive famine only to lose children to this cruel disease, or watch loved ones survive only to carry visible reminders of their ordeal. In a society already obsessed with the visible signs of sin and sickness, smallpox survivors bore both a burden and proof of survival. Influenza and other respiratory fevers rounded out the picture. Medieval medical writers referred vaguely to epidemic catarrhs, or pestilential fevers that swept across regions in waves. These were likely influenza or other viral outbreaks. Sudden coughs, fevers and body aches incapacitated entire communities, often during harsh winters when nutrition was already poor. Deaths were high among the elderly, and even survivors were left weakened, prone to pneumonia or other complications. Chroniclers sometimes lumped these epidemics together with plague, unable to distinguish their causes but keenly aware of their effects. What made these epidemics especially terrifying was their invisibility. Unlike leprosy, which marked its victims with visible lesions, or plague, which produced dramatic buboes, dysentery and typhus often began with symptoms indistinguishable from minor ailments. By the time communities recognised an epidemic, it had already spread. Medieval medicine had no way to identify microbes, and treatments, herbal tonics, bleeding or purging rarely helped. The randomness of survival deepened the fear. Two people might drink from the same well, sleep in the same bed, or live in the same household, yet only one succumbed. To contemporaries, this felt less like biology and more like divine judgment. The social impact was immense. Outbreaks disrupted trade, emptied markets, and closed schools and churches. Parents hesitated to send children into crowded streets, and travellers feared lodging in inns where lice or contaminated food might lurk. Epidemics also compounded other disasters. During famines, weakened bodies were easy prey for disease. During sieges, cramped defenders fell victim to dysentery and typhus long before enemy swords reached them. In some cases, disease killed more than battle or hunger combined. For medieval city dwellers, epidemics were a constant reminder of fragility. Fires might destroy homes, leprosy might exile neighbours, but dysentery, typhus, and other fevers struck without warning, sweeping away families in days. They were silent killers, invisible and inescapable, flourishing in the very conditions that made cities prosper: crowds, trade, and close human contact. Unlike the slow wasting of leprosy or the spectacle of plague, these diseases were quieter but no less deadly, threading themselves into the background of medieval urban life. In the end, the crowded medieval city was as dangerous as it was vital. Fires could erase entire neighbourhoods in an evening. Leprosy could mark the unlucky with lifelong exile. And epidemics could sweep through streets unseen, leaving only graves and unanswered questions. Where plague and famine offered the terror of scale, these smaller but frequent killers offered the terror of unpredictability. They reminded townsfolk daily that death did not need to arrive with flames or buboes. It could come quietly, carried in water, lice or breath without ever showing its face. Fire might consume homes, plague might take whole streets, famine might starve villages, but for many people, the true terror began after the last breath. The church taught that death was not an ending, but a gateway to judgment, and beyond judgment lay either the bliss of heaven or the torments of hell. No earthly pain, however sharp, could rival the imagined horrors of eternal fire, demons, and unending punishment. Medieval sermons, artwork, and literature made sure this fear stayed vivid. Parish priests preached frequently on the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, and the emphasis fell heavily on the dangers of sin. The afterlife was not abstract theology, it was presented as an immediate threat. Parishioners were told that a single unconfessed sin could condemn them forever, and that hell's torments would be infinitely worse than anything they might endure in life. In towns already familiar with plague pits and public executions, the idea of endless fire resonated strongly. It provided not only comfort for the righteous, but also a powerful tool for discipline. The imagery of hellfire was especially effective because it echoed familiar experiences, and people knew what it felt like to be burned by a cooking pot, scorched by a forge, or singed by a house fire. Preachers expanded on those sensations, urging listeners to imagine them multiplied beyond comprehension and endured without relief for eternity. Manuscripts and church paintings reinforced the message, depicting demons with pitchforks, cauldrons filled with the damned, and rivers of flame. For an illiterate population, these images carried the weight of undeniable truth. A villager staring at a mural of writhing souls in hell did not need theological training to understand the warning. The doctrine of purgatory, which took shape in the 12th and 13th centuries, did little to soften the fear. While it allowed for the possibility of eventual salvation after a period of purification, purgatorial fire was still imagined as painful and terrifying. The distinction between hell and purgatory was one of permanence rather than intensity. Both involved torment by flames, but only one was temporary. For many believers, the thought of suffering even a century of purgatorial agony was enough to inspire dread, especially when contrasted with the possibility of immediate damnation. Confession and penance were meant to provide reassurance, but they also reinforced the fear of failure. What if one forgot a sin? What if death came suddenly, before absolution could be granted? The suddenness of plague, accident, or battlefield wounds made this a constant anxiety. Medieval manuals of confession urged priests to remind parishioners of the stakes, stressing that the devil prowled at the moment of death, eager to snatch away the soul. Deathbed scenes in manuscripts often depict angels and demons wrestling over the departing spirit, a visual reminder that the outcome was never certain until the very end. The fear of hell was not just individual, but communal. Authorities used it to shape behaviour, linking social order to eternal consequences. Heretics, witches, and criminals were not merely threats to earthly peace, they endangered the whole community's relationship with God. Executions, especially by fire, were framed as warnings of the eternal fire that awaited the unrepentant. Even natural disasters and epidemics were preached as glimpses of divine judgment, earthly previews of the suffering that awaited in the afterlife. For all its severity, this focus on damnation was not only about control, it also reflected the profound uncertainty of medieval life. When famine, war, and disease could claim anyone without warning, the only certainty was the Church's promise that the soul would face consequences beyond the grave. This belief gave coherence to suffering. Earthly pain was temporary, but eternal punishment was avoidable, if one lived rightly. That tension made damnation the ultimate fear. No matter how gruesome the deaths described in chronicles, the thought of burning forever in hell dwarfed them all. In the end, the medieval obsession with hellfire reveals the depth of spiritual anxiety in a world already steeped in physical danger. Death by sword, rope, water or plague might come at any time, but each of those deaths carried the greater terror of what followed. The grave was not the final destination, it was the doorway to judgment. And for many, the greatest fear was not dying, but discovering too late that their death had led to an eternity of torment more dreadful than any earthly flame. Emerging in the late Middle Ages, particularly after the devastation of the Black Death, the dance of death became one of the most recognisable cultural motifs of mortality. It was not confined to churches or manuscripts. It appeared on walls, in cemeteries and in the language of sermons. The message was simple but chilling: death spares no one. The danse macabre typically depicted skeletons or personifications of death, leading a procession of people from all walks of life: kings and queens, merchants and peasants, bishops and monks, even children. Each figure was paired with death, shown tugging them along in a grotesque parody of a dance. The point was unmistakable. No matter one's station, wealth or piety, the grave would eventually claim everyone. For medieval audiences, already accustomed to sudden loss from plague and famine, the imagery struck close to home. Preachers eagerly adopted the theme in sermons. They warned congregations that the devil waited to ensnare the unprepared, and that life was merely a brief prelude to eternal judgment. To drive the point home, they drew on the danse macabre as a visual aid, describing how death would come without warning, seizing rich and poor alike. Some sermons took on a theatrical quality, listing occupations and social roles one by one, only to declare at each stage that death had summoned them. For listeners, the repetition hammered home the universality of mortality. The popularity of the motif owed much to the trauma of the 14th century. The Black Death had wiped out vast portions of Europe's population, leaving behind mass graves, abandoned villages and shattered communities. Survivors lived with the constant reminder that death was arbitrary and indiscriminate. The danse macabre gave form to that anxiety, turning it into a communal lesson rather than a private terror. In a way, it allowed society to process the shock of mass mortality by visualizing it as a shared experience. Artistic representations varied. Some murals were somber and formal, with skeletal figures leading dignified processions. Others leaned into the grotesque, showing corpses half decayed, mocking the living as they pulled them into the dance. The mocking tone was deliberate. It humbled the proud by showing kings and bishops reduced to the same state as beggars. Wealth and status, the images insisted, offered no immunity. For townsfolk viewing these murals on church walls, the lesson was unavoidable. Each time they entered to pray, they were reminded that their turn in the dance was coming. The motif also seeped into literature and performance. Poets composed verses in which death addressed the living directly, demanding they reflect on their vanity and sin. Travelling performers staged morality plays that echoed the same message, with actors representing different social types, summoned by death on stage. These performances blurred the line between entertainment and instruction, embedding the lesson in cultural memory. Audiences may have laughed at the satire, but the laughter was uneasy, for everyone knew the truth it contained. Beyond its immediate moral lesson, the danse macabre reflected broader shifts in medieval spirituality. Earlier centuries had emphasized heaven and salvation as central themes, but the late Middle Ages leaned more heavily on the certainty of death and the risk of damnation. The danse macabre did not promise comfort, it demanded preparation. It urged people to confess, repent and live piously, for the end could come at any time. By making death universal and unavoidable, it removed excuses. No one could claim immunity through wealth, learning or office. The persistence of this imagery into the Renaissance shows how deeply it resonated. Even as Europe recovered from plague and famine, the skeletal dancers remained on walls and in sermons, a reminder that human progress did not erase mortality. For medieval people, the sight of those murals or the sound of those sermons reinforced what plague pits, gallows and battlefields already proved. Death was always close, and preparation for the afterlife mattered more than anything achieved in life. In the end, the danse macabre served the same function as fire and brimstone preaching, to keep the reality of death vivid in people's minds. Where hellfire threatened eternal pain, the dance reminded them that entry into that realm was inevitable. Together, they framed existence as a brief pause before judgment, urging listeners and viewers to live not for worldly success, but for the salvation of their souls. If the Danse Macabre reminded people that no one could escape the grave, the daily response was not simply despair, but preparation. Fear of hellfire and sudden death pressed medieval Christians to structure their lives around what the church called the ars moriendi, the art of dying well. Prayers, pilgrimages, and rituals of confession were not only acts of devotion, but insurance policies against the worst outcome. Death was always near, but with the right preparation, it might be faced with hope rather than terror. Prayers were the most constant response, morning and evening devotions, recitation of the Pater Noster, and appeals to saints were ways of keeping death and judgment in mind. The Virgin Mary and Saint Michael the Archangel were especially invoked at the hour of death, with believers pleading for protection from demons and intercession before Christ's throne. Prayer books and books of hours often contained sections specifically designed for the dying, teaching families what words to speak at the bedside. The repetitive rhythm of prayer helped turn abstract fear into concrete action, assuring believers that they were not helpless before the unknown. Confession reinforced this sense of readiness. The sacrament was framed as essential for avoiding damnation, since unconfessed sins could tip the scales at judgment. Priests urged parishioners to confess regularly, not only at Easter, but whenever illness or travel loomed. The suddenness of plague or accident made the urgency obvious. No one knew when their last chance might come. Deathbed confession became an ideal, with the priest rushing to administer absolution before the soul departed. The presence of confessionals in even small parishes shows how thoroughly the fear of damnation shaped the infrastructure of daily worship. Pilgrimages offered another form of preparation, travelling to holy sites, whether the shrine of St. James at Compostela, the relics of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, or local saints' tombs, was understood as both penance and insurance. Pilgrims sought healing, forgiveness, and spiritual merit that might shorten their time in purgatory. These journeys were often grueling, but the hardships themselves were part of the spiritual value. To endure hunger, fatigue, and danger on the road was to demonstrate devotion, and medieval people believed that such efforts would be weighed favourably at judgment. Pilgrimages thus turned fear of death into a physical, communal activity, binding towns and villages into networks of shared hope. Preparation also extended to material arrangements. Wills became more common in the later Middle Ages, not simply to divide property, but to ensure prayers for the soul. Wealthy patrons endowed chantries, chapels where priests would say masses for their souls in perpetuity. Even modest peasants might set aside money for candles or small offerings, believing these would help speed their souls through purgatory. The practice reflected a practical response to fear. If death was inevitable, one could at least shape what followed by investing in spiritual aid. The ars moriendi literature of the 15th century distilled these practices into guides for the dying. These texts described the temptations faced on the deathbed, despair, impatience, disbelief, and offered prayers and rituals to resist them. They emphasized the importance of accepting death calmly, trusting in Christ's mercy, and receiving the sacraments properly. Families were encouraged to surround the dying with prayers, candles, and holy water, creating a miniature battlefield where angels and demons struggled for the soul. The popularity of such manuals shows how deeply ingrained the fear of damnation was, but also how communities sought structured ways to face it. Even daily routines reflected this preoccupation. Parish bells tolled not only for funerals, but also as reminders of mortality. Artworks in churches depicted skeletons, graves, and scenes of judgment, ensuring that worshippers never forgot their eventual fate. Festivals like All Souls' Day reinforced the link between the living and the dead, encouraging prayers for departed relatives while reminding the living that they too would soon join them. The cycle of the year itself became a constant rehearsal for death and the afterlife. In the end, fear shaped medieval daily life not only through terror, but through discipline. Prayers, pilgrimages, confessions, and preparations for a good death gave structure to existence in a world where war, famine, and disease were constant threats. The medieval answer to fear was not to deny it, but to ritualize it, transforming anxiety into habit. To live well was to prepare to die well, and to die well was to secure the soul against the torments that preachers, murals, and the danse macabre so vividly promised. For a society steeped in mortality, this was the closest thing to comfort, the knowledge that one's final moments could still be shaped by faith, even if everything else in life had been unpredictable. From the battlefield to the plague pit, from the gallows to the thatched village fire, the people of the Middle Ages lived with death so closely that it shaped nearly every part of their culture. What seems macabre to modern readers was, for them, a daily reality. Life expectancy was short, medicine was limited, and accidents or disasters were never far away. To be medieval was to live in the shadow of mortality, where each passing season might bring famine, epidemic, or war. The great fear was not only of dying, but of how one died. Some deaths were seen as more horrifying than others: starvation's slow wasting, plague swift buboes and fevers, drowning suffocation, or the deliberate cruelty of torture before execution. Others carried stigma as well as pain. Hanging marked criminals with dishonour, while leprosy condemned sufferers to a living death of exile and shame. Fires could erase entire neighbourhoods in a night, while water ordeals, shipwrecks and battlefield chaos reminded people that both nature and human violence were equally dangerous. No rank, wealth or office could guarantee safety. Kings died of dysentery, knights suffocated in their armour, peasants starved in famines, and townsfolk perished in epidemics. Yet the physical dangers only tell half the story. Medieval culture layered death with profound spiritual meaning. The fear of damnation loomed larger than the sword or the noose. Preachers filled churches with sermons on hellfire, purgatory and the Last Judgment. Artists painted skeletons and demons on church walls, ensuring no one forgot their fate. The danse macabre mocked rich and poor alike, showing that all would eventually join death's procession. Even when plague, famine or fire seemed arbitrary, people believed that divine judgment lay behind it. The possibility of eternal torment was the ultimate terror, dwarfing even the worst earthly suffering. This constant awareness of mortality shaped daily life. People prayed to saints for protection, confessed sins frequently, and went on pilgrimages to holy shrines in search of spiritual security. Families commissioned prayers and masses for their souls after death, building chantries or leaving gifts in their wills. The church developed the ars moriendi, the art of dying well, to guide the faithful through their final hours. Bells told reminders of mortality, festivals honoured the dead, and murals displayed the universality of the grave. These practices were not morbid obsessions, but coping mechanisms turning fear into structural ritual. Seen from a distance, the Middle Ages might appear as an age of unrelenting gloom. But fear also gave life urgency and meaning. It reminded people to prepare, to live piously, and to value community in the face of disaster. Death was terrifying, but it was also the great equalizer, erasing the differences between noble and peasant, soldier and monk. To medieval people, this knowledge demanded respect, caution and constant preparation. In the end, what frightened them most was not the axe, the rope, or even the plague. It was the belief that the story did not end with the grave, that beyond the final breath lay judgment, and beyond judgment either eternal joy or eternal fire. That conviction, more than any battlefield or epidemic, shaped the medieval experience of death. And it is this blend of physical danger and spiritual dread that made dying in the Middle Ages not only a constant risk, but the ultimate human fear. Good night.